Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Dr. Mike Bell, the Executive Director of the Jenny Craig Institute for the Study of War and Democracy, and it's my pleasure and privilege to serve as the Master of Ceremonies for today's program. You know, today is like one of those mornings, you know, the tanks have been refueled, the infantry's weapons are cleaned, they had some Spam and maybe some reconstituted eggs, and, you know, the artillery's in position, and we're ready to continue mission into this final assault. And so some of you, you dust off the last night's sleep. Maybe you got to sleep on the back deck of the tank or underneath it, and we're ready to move out and continue mission. So, you know, this has been a remarkable week, an incredible week to celebrate the achievements, not just completion of the campus, but also hosting the annual convention of the Congressional Medal of Honor Society. An incredible celebration as part of that, very fitting capstone. In addition, you know, we've opened our capstone exhibit space near and dear to me, Liberation Pavilion, and we really wanted to think of a good and fitting way to bring this to a very fitting conclusion as we move forward. You know, the week has been very much about what's been achieved. The conclusion here allows us to go back in time a little bit and think about how we got here, the how. And, you know, some of the amazing challenges, insights, inspirations. Now, in 1954, 10 years after landing on Pointe du Hoc, General James Rudder, who had led the Rangers on that assault, returned to Normandy with his son and with a reporter. He remarked, you know, quote, "Will you tell me how we did this? Anyone would be a fool to try this. It was crazy then and it's crazy now." And so this might be one of those Rudder days where you look back and go, how the hell did you do that? If you realized then what you were going to do or why you would do it, you know, there it is. So, well, 23 years after the museum, you know, landed on that little rocky shore and began scaling the cliffs with the opening of the D-Day Museum, we get to reflect on, in Rudder words, how we did this. And so now, some of you, familiar with our programs both here at the Madeline Paul Hilliard Conference Center and the Higgins Hotel, and those watching online, you know, we have a bit of a tradition here. And so first we want to start really with a solemn recognition. Any World War II veterans, home front workers, Holocaust survivors with us today, please stand and be recognized. You can wave if you don't want to stand. And let's give them an incredible, thought we had some, here we go, yep. So an incredible week, just being inspired by the veterans and really taking the baton of their legacy. Now, we'd also like to recognize any veterans of our nation's armed forces, active duty military from any era. You know, please stand and wave or be recognized as well. Veterans? Thank you for your service, and thank you to the families. You know, there was an old bumper sticker we used to see, you know, Army wife, toughest job in the Army. And yeah, I know without my wife's support, you know, we couldn't have sustained all those deployments over time. And you know, thanks for that. Thanks, veterans, service members, families. Thanks for what you do. I'd also like to acknowledge our incredible Patriot Circle members and charter members. Without their support, none of this would be possible. I mean, you know, how would you do it? And so, Patriot Circle and charter members, how about if you stand as well and we can acknowledge you? Now, you know, today's program, like all of our programming, is made possible with the support you provide. It allows us to continue that mission, educating the present, the future generations, really about the war that changed the world, an epic conflict, and understanding its legacy. I'd also like to acknowledge some of the leadership of this institution that's allowed us to move forward over the years. You know, this is an incredible team effort. You know, long ago when I was at West Point, I tried to think about where do I go when I'm a young lieutenant? What do I choose? you know, and the advice I got from one of the faculty was, go where there's a mission. If there's a mission, everything else will fall into place. You'll have the leaders, the people, the resources. This place has an incredible mission. It's also buoyed up, though, by incredible people, the people that make it happen every day, that are passionate about that mission. So our Board of Trustees, many of whom are with us here today, Will Osborne, glad you're here. Stephen Watson, our President and CEO. Of course, Dr. Mueller, you'll see more of him here in a bit. We have Chief Architect Bart Vorsanger in the audience. Thanks for what you've done over the years to conceive this place. There's also been some great supporters of this week's event and also the museum, Major General Dave Mize. Thanks for what you've done. The kind of quietly behind the scenes orchestrated some incredible military support this last week. And really, we owe you a salute for what you were able to pull off. And, almost seamlessly, everybody just expected, oh, there's another flyover. Here it goes. So thanks for that. Really appreciate the efforts. And I want to give a shout out to our amazing volunteers that, if there's ever a day I come in a little bit draggled, I see some volunteers and, I feel like I'm ready to continue mission again. You really put the passion into this place, and I appreciate every moment of what you do, the passion you have for this, and the commitment to this museum. So how about we all give a round of applause to our volunteers. And certainly I got to thank our museum team and staff. We get to ride them pretty hard. We've done some amazing work this year. We've had over 8 million people read our online content. Imagine that, kind of cool. But hey, that's not enough. Our goal is 30 million people a year, and we're going to keep moving. And I think all this is doable. But team, over there, thanks for everything you've done behind the scenes. I really appreciate, all the folks that make this happen. It's not just the folks on the stage that allow this to pull off. It's the people every day that work all those issues. So let's get into the day's program. And there's really no better person to start us off when we talk about the National D-Day Museum than Dr. Nick Mueller. Now, Nick, as many of you know, this goes without saying, but maybe for the home audience that isn't familiar, Nick is the President and CEO Emeritus of the National WWII Museum and the co-founder with Dr. Stephen Ambrose. Nick served as the chairman of the board of the museum from 1998 to 2000 before becoming the president and CEO for an impressive 17 years. Under Nick's leadership, the museum was established, maneuvered through numerous setbacks, really changed its mission into a national mandate, and has become this wonderful campus and, frankly, one of the leading institutions in the world. Now, Nick stepped into his emeritus role. I'm not sure exactly what that is yet, in 2017. And really, he's worked on various publications, including Everything We Have, which is an incredible piece of work, and 2 other publications outlining the history of the museum. So what a perfect person to have us today. One's a pictorial collection, and the other's a larger manuscript that'll be published in 2025. So here's how it's going to work today. Nick's going to come up, and for about 45 minutes, he's going to lay out his kind of grand overview of the how we got here of the museum. A little bit up even to the present. This will frame the roundtables that we have. The first roundtable is going to focus on those early years then. Then we've got the second one will come in and look at the growth and expansion after becoming the National WWII Museum. And I've got the honor to chair the final one on liberation. And so without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Dr. Nick Mueller to the stage.
Well, welcome everybody. It's been a great 3 days, and Stephen Watson, thank you for everything you've done to make this just one of the best 3 days in the history of the museum, and one that I'll remember mainly because it's done. And Stephen got it to that point, and so I'm just deeply grateful. I did want to mention, I think Patrick Gallagher was here, our brilliant designer somewhere. Wave your hand back there, and made the magic happen in all of our exhibits, including this last one, the Liberation Pavilion. And I think we have some, I know we have some presidential counselors here. You all wave your hands here that from advisory, is 1, 2, 3 at least. So in any event, these are advisors who helped us. So, well, anyway, what I'm going to do today, this is the more lighthearted approach. We've had a lot of serious content about the completion of the museum and what it means today in the Liberation Pavilion, and we'll get a little bit to that in our panels as well as my remarks. But so I'm going to talk a little bit about the origins of the party without dwelling too much on the Sherry Party, because I think all of you heard that about 4 times already this this conference. But everybody I think in here probably knows that story. So now, Mike said 45 minutes. Now, Boise, when I was chairman, used to tell me, Nick, when I gave reports to the board, you know, we know you're a historian coming from the university, but you got to learn to stop talking in 50-minute segments. So after 23 years, Mike has got me cut down to 45 minutes, so from 50. So anyway, and now as I get older, I got to have just a moment of levity here. You know, at my age, and I'm trying to think about something humorous to start us off with. It's kind of early in the morning, but and it kind of it's personal in a way because it's about an old guy about my age who gets a white Porsche, which I have, and he buys it, and he's just reliving his youth, and he's driving down the highway, and he's singing along with the Beatles and Crosby, Stills, and Nash, and all of these oldies, and he's going faster and faster, and he's 80, 90, 100, 110, 120, and boy, he's just enjoying the heck out of himself as this blue light comes up, pulls him over and says, highway patrolman says, what in the world were you thinking? Do you know how fast you were going? He says, oh, I just reliving my youth, and he said, I'm sorry, officer. He says, you got to give me a better excuse than that. If you could think of a story I haven't heard, you know, I'll let you go. So he says, well, tell you the truth. He said, about 10 years ago, my wife ran off with a highway patrolman, and I thought you were bringing her back. So, anyway. So what we're going to talk about is memories today, for the most part, and these are, as I said, on the lighthearted side, and have some slides already ready up there to indicate the kind of the connectivity here, but between this story, beginning with the landing craft and going to the present. So, but then I'm not sure where I point this. There you go. So that's the cover of the new book that Mike just mentioned, and that is a pictorial photographic essay with a little slim history, and it's the next. This is the prequel. The sequel will be out in a couple of years. So, and the story really has a couple of beginnings. The first really goes back, and I want to spend a little bit of time with my friendship with Stephen Ambrose that has preceded the epiphany moment, or the eureka moment, I would say. And goes back to 1971 when I first helped as part of the team recruiting him to UNO, LSU in New Orleans at that time. And the second beginning is when he had that moment in 1990 that led to the idea for the D-Day Museum. And LSU and UNO are all mixed up in all of that. And I just got to say, too, that, and I've said it several times, University of New Orleans is largely forgotten here, but for 10 years, at least 8 of those, from 1990, we didn't have any staff at the museum. We got capital money from the federal government. We couldn't spend it on operations, so we weren't raising much private money, so we didn't have much money to pay for staff, or none. I mean, there was a part-time assistant. The University of New Orleans had senior-level people besides Steve and myself who were involved all those years at the vice president of financial accounting and the foundation and so forth. So, but in any event, I'm going to go a quick fly through some photographs that go back to all the various activities that Steve Ambrose and I were just hit it off together, and Grace and Stephanie over there. So they were little kids when all this started, and his only two surviving daughters. And I don't know how old both of you guys were in '71, but you were about 11, okay, and Grace a little bit younger. So our families kind of grew up together, and Steve and I loved everything, sports and outdoors and sailing and canoeing, and we got into projects and all kinds of adventures. And I think it's important to understand a little bit of that, because it's all of those projects and conferences we put on together, and started his D-Day tour, and those things built up a reservoir of trust between us. So vacations, camping, everything was going on all those years. And this is going to be a little scrolling time to going back to those adventures. And I don't know if I click that through. Well, there's young Nick starting our summer school in Austria. And there's Steve, D-Day to the Rhine tours. We started in 1980, and actually that has some precedent. Areas we're sailing down in the Virgin Islands, and over in Austria, one of the castles over there during the summer school that we visited, and up in Wisconsin with his son Hugh, and just one week we went off to St. John and bought a villa together down there, and Steve, and then comes on Private Ryan and the Hollywood to the rescue. And Steve never could decide if he wanted to be Meriwether Lewis or Hemingway, but but that's sort of a little bit of a flashback. So to give you kind of a sense of, for 20 years leading up to that party, we just did everything together. Every time we meet in backyards, it was either planning a canoe trip or a sailing trip or going somewhere, doing something, or starting out projects. And during those years, not only just we always agreed that we're going to do something, and a lot of times it was pretty challenging, but other times it was just a pure pleasure. But for me, on my side, Steve, I had sort of the entrepreneurial spirit, and I was in administration by then, and as a dean and vice chancellor, and I had always had the job at the university. I was the designated startup guy, so I had to figure out how to generate the programs I wanted to do over in Austria or wherever without any funds, and actually they had to generate new revenue. So there was that part of it, and Steve knew about that. And so that day when he finally decided to do a D-Day museum, he thought that I'd be the one to try to figure that out. But in any event, this is where it started. I mean, these three, the pictures, Ike, Higgins, and Ambrose, and that is the epiphany moment. And he said, we can put my Eisenhower Center in this museum, and that'll take care of all of these 650 oral histories of D-Day veterans that he had collected. And the museum would be a way to support and sustain that Eisenhower Center and all of the research that he had done, because Steve was thinking, you know, in 4, 5, 6 years, I'm going to retire, and I want to make sure that this center continues forever. And it was going to be on the lakefront, where I was getting ready to build a research park or develop it, and I'll come to that in just a moment. So I had done all these other programs, and his tours, and summer school, largest in Europe and from America, conferences, created a college at the university. And one thing that both of us loved was to bring history to life in larger contexts for larger audiences. So that cut across a great many of the things that we had done up until this point. But what really brought us together is this, and you've seen Hal Baumgarten before, and I'll let him speak for himself, because that was the germination of the
We
idea?
started running across the beach. We were about 500 yards out. So we're neck deep in water. When we got to the actual beach, the sand was wet and tide was treacherous. It went out fast and came in fast. Came in one inch a minute. So we hit the sand. We were running across sand at 300 yards out. So I landed. There's an artificial pier on that beach nowadays. It wasn't there on D-Day. I landed right where that artificial pier is, a little to the right of that one tank that was firing. So I was all the way on the western part of Dog Green sector. The next beach over was called Charlie Beach. That's where the Rangers actually landed. They didn't land on Dog Green. But anyway, there were a group of us running across the beach with our rifles at port arms, which is the rifle across your chest. When we got to about 135 yards away from the seawall, a machine gun spray came from the trenches up on the bluff. And I heard a loud thud on my right front, and my rifle vibrated. I turned it over. There was a clean hole through its receiver, which is a little rectangular plate in front of the trigger guard. My 7 bullets had stopped in the magazine section, had stopped the German bullet. Another thud behind me to the left, and that guy was gone too. I hit the sand behind the hedgehog, which is about 130 yards from the seawall, and I observed to my right Private Robert Dittmar, Fairfield, Connecticut. I was yelling. He tripped over the hedgehog, spun completely around, lying on his back and yelling, "I'm hit, I'm hit, Mom, Mother," and then he was silent. I looked over to my left, and Sergeant Clarence Robeson of Lynchburg, Virginia. I always mention their names and where they came from. I don't want people to forget about them. Clarence Robeson was staggering by me without his helmet, gaping hole in the left side of his forehead. His blonde hair was streaked with blood. I was yelling, "Get down." This used to be my nightmares. I'd be yelling, "Get down," because I never forgot that scene. And I guess he couldn't hear me anyway. The noise on that beach was horrendous. All these shells coming in, flamethrowers blowing up with the guys getting on fire. Noise was tremendous.
Well, I want to tell you that the real inspiration for the D-Day Museum was people like Hal Baumgarten. And it went on for 7 years before he had the idea. He had actually tried to convince members of Congress to do a World War II museum or a D-Day museum. And his offices in the research center where he was collecting and transcribing these oral histories, and Gunter was at, and these would come in, and he'd say, "Come in, listen to this," and it would be a story like that, or "Listen to this audio tape, or this transcript. This stuff is great stuff. We're saving that. It's going to all go in my book on D-Day." So this was going on from the time he created the Eisenhower Center in '83 up until the moment that we sat in either his backyard or mine, but that was his little gazebo that out behind his backyard. After Katrina, I went and took that picture, so it was kind of off kilter, and it got moved by the water a little bit. But we'd sit there afternoon, and he was close to campus, so I'd go by, and that's when he had the idea to do a research park, a museum on the research park, and he said, "I had just gotten that assignment to on that site right there was where Higgins tested the landing craft," and he says, "It's the perfect site. It's free land. I've got my Eisenhower Center. I'll give you my oral histories, and all we need is $1 million." And you heard that. We missed by a little bit. I thought it was $4 million, and there are a few zeros after that now that are over $400 million. But in any event, let me just let you have Steve talk a little bit.
It was a world war, and half of it was in the Pacific. That's the significance of the Pacific Theater. We have built this museum the people of New Orleans, the people of Louisiana, and people from all over the world. It began in my backyard when I was having a sherry with Nick, and I had received quite a few artifacts from the men that I had been interviewing for a book on D-Day, and I said, Nick, we got to build a museum to hold this stuff. I can't keep storing it in my office, which was overcrowded anyway, and that's how it got started. And Arthur Davis, the famous architect, said, I'll tell you, we talked and got going, and Arthur said, you've got to get Charlie Guggenheim to make a film for you, and we did. And he said, and you've got to get Jack Macy as the designer. He had met Jack when they were working on the Louisiana Centennial exhibit here. It wasn't the Centennial exhibit, what was it called? I've already forgotten. World's Fair, the Louisiana World's Fair. So I went up to New York to meet Jack, and we went out to Ellis Island, and he had designed the museum there, and we were walking through, and it's most impressive, and we came to, and we just stopped. And you'll see him in the Pacific exhibit here, right in the middle, a little stand-up case, and then glass around it, and inside one pair of baby shoes. And then a little biography of those shoes. They had come all the way from Hamburg, Germany, to Ellis Island. It must have been an infant who was wearing them. And there were those shoes. And Jack said to me, you see in museums, everybody was stopping at this. You see in museums, smaller is better. And you look at the...
Well, so that was in 2001, one of the last times Stephen Ambrose appeared on camera. It was just about 8-9 months before he passed away. But in any event, go back to the story, and that's the research park in the master plan, and you can see in the inset down there on the left, that is the location. We actually cited the pavilion to be there, and but our board of directors were smarter than we were, and they kept saying, you got to go downtown. Well, that decision didn't come overnight. It was a big controversy, and Steve admitted in the newspaper, he said, I lost a lot of friends, burned a lot of bridges because of insisting that it be in this research park site for so long. And I was president and in charge of developing the site, but I kind of had a sense where the board was going. And Steve wanted it there. The chancellor wanted it there. I was caught between my best friend and my boss. It was really hard to say, Steve, we're going downtown because this is what the business leaders want. But you know, it was a threshold issue that was deeper than that. And we had a consultant, a brilliant woman from Baltimore, came in to talk to us about marketing and developing. We could pay for some consultants, and Jack Macy, the designer, was one of them on the exhibit side. And she'd done a lot of museum work, and she posed a question to the board, and she said, you know, there are two options for you, and which way you decide is going to determine where you locate this museum. You've got to decide if you're going to be an education research center that happens to have a museum attached, or you're going to be a museum that happens to have an education center attached. Both ideas will work. If you decide research and education is the singular most important thing you want to accomplish in the Eisenhower Center, you can get a lot of grants, a lot of foundation money from just being a research center on a university campus. You won't have many tourists. And Steve always said, well, we don't need a lot of tourists. We just got to support my Eisenhower Center. But if you decide you need the tourists, and we think you do, because it'll be an attraction, and we don't want to spend this time and money if we don't have tourists. So it ended up then going downtown. We had a lot of disappointments during the first 5 or 6 years. We were supposed to open in 1994. That didn't happen. We did have an Academy Award winning or nominated film, the top 5, D-Day Remembered, a great, great film. And we had a big premiere of that, and then we all went off. Steve went off and briefed the White House gang, the Clintons and Christopher White, all going to Normandy for D-Day. We were with Tom Brokaw, 500 people on a tour ship for a full day in '94. It was really a moving moment. I've been there many times with Steve, but that was a powerful, powerful moment. And Tom Brokaw had Steve on stage all day long with Katie Couric on D-Day on those commemoration events. And Brokaw said, look, you can talk about the D-Day Museum you're building anytime you want, you know. So, and Steve did. I thought, oh, man, you know, the money's just going to come pouring in. And, well, wrong about that, too. So, but it was, he kept our visibility up. But it was up and down. And Steve and I were still teaching, doing our job at the university. We were on the board, but the board had its own life and chairman. And anyway, it never hired an executive director because we didn't have the money to do it or didn't make the money available for that. And so it was really a volunteer board all those times and went broke a couple times. I mean, except that federal money of $4 million, we were just living on fumes. And Steve was having to write checks out of his own checkbook to pay for the one halftime secretary that we had. And so it kind of is one of those times. Now, I was on sabbatical going back to teaching after 20 years as a vice chancellor. And I was in the middle of sabbatical. It was a cold January day, bright and beautiful outside. And we just bought this old warehouse down here. And that's where we were renovating that. We got some money from the state to do that. The last $1 million of federal money went to buy that old warehouse, which was uninhabitable. I mean, they had to change walls, new roof, new wiring, air conditioning, and fortunately the state had come through with some money for capital. And so that was going on, and I'm coming down to the executive committee meeting, and who's standing outside on a cold day? I mean, it was like one of those 30-degree days, and the wind was blowing, but it was a clear sky, but I was freezing. I only had a jacket on, and they're standing on the front porch of that Eisenhower Center and next to the warehouse. General Livingston, Medal of Honor recipient, Greg O'Brien, the chancellor, and Steve. I'm thinking, those guys are crazy. I'm trying to get in that place. I'm not going to stand out there and talk. What are they doing? I said, well, I know Stephen's out there smoking because he always had to go out. By now, you had to go outside to smoke. But General Livingston and I'm trying to run by, and they grabbed me and on the way in said, Nick, wait a minute here. And I said, what for? It's cold. He says, well, General said, we're thinking about you for being the next chairman. Said, this is not in my plans here. Ambrose grabbed my hand and said, Nick, you got me into this. You got to get us out of it. And I said, well, can you give me a few months to think about this? Because the elections weren't until next January. And I got home that night and I said, Steve Ambrose, what the world are you doing to me? You had already developed some other plans that we were going to do before, just a month before. He said, I needed reinforcements. I couldn't tell you because I didn't have O'Brien there, the chancellor and general. He says, you'd say no. And so in any event, so sometimes you get, hooked up on things that you didn't expect at all. But it was a pretty desperate time. I mean, to pick another historian to run this place, you knew the business leaders were running out of gas. And a lot of people at that time thought, even with the warehouse, that we weren't going to make it, that we were dead on arrival. I mean, I had friends in the business community and the newspaper. They really gave us a break by not publicizing the desperate financial situations that we were in. But in any event, I should say that is the only rendering that we have extant of the building of the museum on the lakefront. And there at the corner on the right is the original warehouse. The left will come to that story in just a moment. In any event, we got going. We had a couple of years to meet yet the fourth goal, I think it was, for opening. And Boise was fortunately my vice chairman at the time and gave me tremendous support in developing the museum and I'm going to leave that story till later, but some state funds for the Louisiana Pavilion. In any event, we got to Hollywood folks. I mean, some of them, one of them was still with us last night, and the night before, Tom Hanks and Steven Spielberg, and Saving Private Ryan happened right in those years of, in the summer of '99 was a premiere, and Steve said, I'll help you guys promote this movie. It's the best war movie I've ever seen on World War II, and he says, in return, you got to agree to come to our grand opening and help me out a little bit. And he said he didn't want any money, but he traveled with them for 3-4 weeks, interviewing veterans on television, promoting the movie. And so here they are on a tour the night before we opened the museum there. In any event, and here's the famous opening ribbon-cutting shot that some of you remember who were there, and I know there are a few here who were there. General Dave Maz was chair of the grand opening committee, and Secretary of Defense Bill Cohen, detailed him to marshal the greatest parade, military parade since World War II. And I can say with a great pride that he did exactly that. And there were 200,000 people on the streets of New Orleans. We had celebrities, we had senators, we had all of our board, we had friends from all over the nation. There was a parade that went on for hours. It was 3 days of very intensive events, a huge reenactment out in City Park. So it was a time for all of us. We just, and of course there were no competing news cycles, so they're going on in the news cycle. So we had national, even global coverage. C-SPAN and CNN were covering it wall to wall for about 8 hours every day, and they ran those shows for forever. And visitation after it was tremendous. Boise succeeded me as chairman initially for 2 years, but his successor went off to Washington, Herschel Abbott, so Boise did another 4 years. And during that time, well, that goes back to the opening moment. And Boise was the chairman of the board after September of 2000. And I couldn't have had a better board leader to help us into what became even more ambitious than our little $4 million project that turned out to be $25 million than Boise. Tremendously well-respected business leader, head of Bollinger Shipyards at the time, very familiar in the halls of Congress. And when we talked to him about doing all of World War II, he said, I know how to do that. And interesting thing, there's one story there that I'll just mention now, is that Senator Stevens, who was very close to Ambrose, he loved Steve Ambrose and invited him up to Alaska to his fishing camp any number of times, and wanted us to do all of World War II, because his war was in the Pacific, in the China, Burma, India, a theater, Distinguished Flying Cross. And we'd already agreed to do the D-Days of the Pacific, because there were all those islands in the Pacific were also D-Day landings, and Higgins boats were part of all of them. But he came by, and I think Boise was at a fundraiser with him a week before we opened on Sunday, and he came by for a private tour, and he had something in Alaska, so he could not be at the grand opening. So he calls us after his tour. He pulls me and Steve into my office and runs off his staffers and sat us down and said, this is the best museum in America on World War II. He says, I know it's D-Day, and I know you're doing the Pacific D-Days, but if you boys will take on all of World War II, I'll help. And nobody else could hear this except me and Steve. Steve was exhausted. I was too. He rolled his eyes. Oh, God, Nick, don't say yes. And of course, you know, if I'd have said no, he'd have walked out and it'd have been fine. And that would have been it. And I said, well, we'll try. And Boise said, yeah, we'll try. And Steve said, and I went to Boise and said, Boise, this is what the senator wants to do. And he says, my God, he says, That's money. So he got us what, 3 or 4 million a year for 3 years. He said, talk to your board, figure out how to do it, how much it's going to cost, and I'll help you get going. Well, in any event, so that was the D-Days of the Pacific. That was the vision for the expansion. And as Boise said a couple of times, I think, in the last few days, it came out pretty much. I mean, we moved the theater to the corner, but these are just a bunch of scrolling videos. That's the Center for the Study of American Spirit. That was, not that that wasn't significant, but Steve Ambrose and I thought that that was to be on the prime corner. That's the heart of the education research program. That's right where the theater is now, but we actually went and designed it, paid the architect. We were ready to build that in 2002, and yeah, did an interview on it, and it was at a press conference. I mean, so this was really a big deal. 3 floors of meeting rooms and research archives, place for publications and distance learning programs. Anyway, it was our Center for the Study of the American Spirit is what Steve and I kind of named it. That became a mouthful, so we got another mouthful. It's a little easier to explain nowadays. It's the Institute for the Study of War and Democracy, so the Jenny Craig Institute. So anyway, we had a wake-up call here with Katrina, and so we were back in the ditch again, and people were saying, you know, New Orleans would never recover. The big controversy or issues on the board. We couldn't meet. The first meeting we had was in Dallas to try to consider a number of different options about going forward. And I'm just going to leave some of these images scroll through. You know this, it's all over the campus here, the various buildings as they're getting built, and to give you some sense of how it progressed. And our architect, who won the competition, Bart Forzanger, said, instead of 1 single building, let's do 7 buildings. That was a critical decision in the selection of the architect, is to have 1 victory at a time. And somehow, Bart, you figured out that this young nonprofit institution didn't have federal income for several $100 million to build a 300,000 square foot museum. So you said, just do 1 building at a time. A few years later, he said, are you ever going to get to the 2nd building? So, in any event, and there was the China-Burma-India Theater and the train car and the dog tag experience that you all pretty well familiar with, I think, and Japanese internment camp in the home front and hotel and conference center. So in any event, it was a string of extraordinary chairmen: Boise Bollinger, David Velker, Pete Wilson, Phil Satry, Herschel Abbott, Richard Atkerson, Jim Corder, who led us through those years when all of that was being built. This is now the Ambrose Reading Room. Steve Ambrose was asked a number of times in board meetings, why don't we put your name on one of these buildings, on one of these exhibits? And Boise, remember, he says, do not put my name anywhere. If you have a chance to put a name up, put the name up of a veteran or a donor to help us get this built, but not my name. And so he was very strict about that. But when I moved my office over to across the street, I said, I think Steve would appreciate and be okay with a reading room which has his typewriter and many of his books in that room. Well, in any event, to get on the more serious side, we begin to move now toward liberation. And I would just say before leaving the topic of Steve Ambrose that he left us with a big idea, a compelling idea. At the basis of it all is that idea continued to move us forward.
Must have been around 3 o'clock.
I'm going to skip this over, and then we'll go right through the rest of the Liberation, and you all have been over there and seen it, I'm sure. And I just do want to say that we had a conference on memory wars a few years ago during COVID, actually. We had to do it digitally. I'm not sure, Stephen, but we had about 13 or 14,000 people watching this online. You think the story of World War II is just one story. Well, we tell the American story, the American experience. But when you have Poles and you have Germans and you have British and you have museums and people from all over the world, the war didn't end in 45 for much of the world. And so there are very contrasting memories about how people remember the war. If you're behind the Iron Curtain, you didn't think the war had stopped at all. You just changed one dictator for another. And these memory wars are growing, and this is a role this museum has in understanding public memory, not just ours, but others, in the sense that it brings us all together. So Steve was already into some of those ideas and thoughts before he passed. And I would just say in his memory that Steve and I didn't get to climb all the mountain peaks that we dreamed about, but we got to quite a few of them. But in the end, we were attracted to the big ideas. We wanted something that was more than a museum, something that could project conferences and programs and overseas tours to anybody who's interested or enthusiastic about World War II. So it was a love of learning and exploding these ideas into larger formats that ideas of just war and peace. The struggle for freedom and democracy ranks right up there with them. Human rights, civil rights, tolerance, how wars begin, how wars end, and the liberating power that changes the lives of people. And Boise, and I want to say that our chairs and board members all through the years of struggling with exhibits and working with Gallagher's team and Borzanger's team got into the ditches of the planning and really had their arms around every concept that we had. Now, of course, one of the conditions that stipulations, I should say, that Senator Stevens said was that if you do all of World War II, I'll get you the congressional designation as the official museum in this country. That was a huge deal, as Boise will remember. It didn't come with money every year. It came with capital money that we had to fight for construction money. We're not like a Smithsonian that gets operating funds every year. We have to generate so we're a very entrepreneurial institution. But they changed our mission to cover all of World War II. So when you go through the Liberation Pavilion, which we have just seen some, you think about the legacy of World War II. What it means today is the last part of that mission. And it's been the hardest pavilion to design. And Mike Bell was at the tip of the spear those last few years and got us across the finish line. And Rob Citino is a senior historian on the project for all the way to the end as well. And myself and Stephen Watson and our curators and collectors and board members. It's been hard, but it's provocative, and it helps people understand that we have a point of view here at this museum, that we were engaged in an existential struggle, a fight for civilization as we knew it. It took everything this country had, its material, economic, financial, human, technological resources of everyone in the nation in order to get through that war to a peaceful end, at least for our parts of the world. We believe that the American spirit and democracy had something to do with that final victory. and that it was indeed the war that changed the world. What it means today is wrapped up a little bit by Stephen, but I'm going to let him speak for himself.
The legacy is a realization on the part of America's youngsters today, in the mid part of the 21st century, at the end of the 21st century, and on through the millennium, a realization freedom doesn't come for free. Sacrifices have to be made. Somebody's got to pay the price if we're going to grow as we have as the freest and richest nation that ever was. But that depends on the willingness of the children to go out and defend. And they will. They are the children of democracy, and when democracy is under attack, they're going to step up and be counted and do what is required, just as their grandfathers and great-grandfathers did.
Well, we know that as uplifting and inspirational as the Liberation Pavilion is about what we have achieved, many dark things came out of World War II and genocide. 65 million dead, 2/3 of them civilians. Kamikaze attacks that later we discovered could happen to us again in 9/11. Attacks on mosques, suicide attacks. Today there's challenges in Israel, Ukraine, potentially Taiwan. Autocracy and authoritarian regimes are still enemies of freedom and democracy. So this Liberation Pavilion has great relevance. But we can't let the darker sides of our history or the world's history, not just ours, paralyze us from moving forward. I think that's one of the great things about America, and I think it comes through here. We don't get everything right all the way, but we keep working at it, and we keep improving. Well, there's the master plan. It's complete now, thanks to Stephen Watson, who put the finishing touches on it here with the Liberation Pavilion, the canopy in the last few years. I think it's come a long way since the backyard in the beginning of that friendship. As Boise said, almost everything that we envisioned earlier, the canopy looks a little different, but all the buildings are pretty much as they were. So to have worked with my dear friend Stephen Ambrose and Boise and all of the other chairs and board members and presidential counselors over the years to bring this magnificent museum to life has been one of the great pleasures of my life. I'm very blessed to have had a part of that. I've always said, people say, wonder what Steve would think. Well, if Steve came back to Earth today and saw this, he'd probably have a heart attack, go back to wherever he came from. But in any event, I see I have 1 minute and 48 seconds before the hook comes out. So thank you all, and special thanks to those here today. And I hope gave you a little bit of flavor of the friendship that started it all and where it led. So the moral of the story is don't drink too much cheap sherry with your best friend who has a big idea. And I think, Mike, that's it, and I will move on. So thank you all very much. Well, now we're going to invite the first panel up here. And I want Diana Bajwa. Y'all just come up as mention your names, and Gunter Bischoff, Boise Bollinger, and Jackie Clarkson. And I think Jackie's going to sit down here. And just let me say a little bit about each of these. Diana Bajwa is a former member of the Louisiana House of Representatives and Senate. She was the first African-American woman to be elected to the Louisiana Senate. She's also a former member of our Board of Trustees. and was involved with helping us get monies from the state for construction. Gunter Bischoff, as I mentioned already earlier to you, that Gunter was the associate director of the Eisenhower Center from 1988 onward. So you could say Gunter was there at the creation as well. He's also a presidential counselor, and so has been advising me and our board and our staff for all of these years, and just recently retired as the Marshall Plan chair at the University of New Orleans. Donald Boise Bollinger, as you already have heard him mention a number of times, executive officer of the Bollinger Enterprises now. It's and still on the museum board of trustees, and was chairman of the board, as you already heard, from 2000 to 2004. And his wife Joy in Boise made the largest single contribution to the museum to build that magnificent canopy. And maybe we'll talk a little bit about our reminiscences about the controversy over that, Boise, in a few moments. And the Honorable Jackie Clarkson here. Jackie served in the Louisiana House of Representatives from 1994 to 2002, and has had multiple tenures on the New Orleans City Council, and former board member as well, and assisted us in our request for funds from Governor Foster and other governors as well. So we're gonna just go down memory lane here, and I'll mention offer a few questions, and we'll see who wants to answer them. In some cases, some people have more familiarity with the topics than others, and so we kind of will spread it around that way, and I'll try to manage the time as best I can. How much time do we have? With 45 minutes, so it's a magical 45 minutes. So, all right, so maybe starting with, at this end, with Boise, just some thoughts. We want to start right before the grand opening, those last couple of years, from 98 to 2000, Boise, about your involvement. You were chairman-elect right behind me, and I leaned on you heavily from the very first. You told me once you didn't even know how you got elected to be vice chairman, and we were not as formal as we were in those days as we are today. You heard about mine was a little bit more formal. It was a little rough and ready, grabbing me on the steps out there. But in any event, talk about that, Boise, those early years right before we opened.
Must have missed the meeting.
That's what happened. Yeah, you missed a meeting and you were chairman.
Actually, it was, because we were going to Baton Rouge, and you said, you got to come with us. You're the vice chairman. I said, since when? But it was, I think that Eisenhower Center brings back so many memories, because we could barely fit in it to have a meeting, and half the board wouldn't show up. It was scary. I mean, I was telling Jim Livingston at dinner last night, I had gone into his office. He was working on Parker Street. And I said, Jim, we got $17 million to raise. Where are we going to get this money? I'm just, the mountain is so large to climb for us to get to the finish line. And he says, I've been wondering the same thing. But the reality is, Steve Ambrose was such an inspiration, and he would never let us get too frustrated. He'd say, we're all in this together, we'll get it done, we have a mission to accomplish, and he energized the board with those comments in his famous dialect, which was always, I hated history in college, but I wish I'd had him for a teacher. I might have been a historian. And I am now.
You are.
But so those early days were just miserably dry as far as our ability to see a clear path that we could get to the finish. And Nick coming in was Steve's answer, and rightfully so, to have somebody. We kind of were loose and who's in charge here? And Nick took the reins. He had already had experience building a project in those days with money. Now he has to build a project without money, and he took the reins, And it made it a lot easier for us to have a person to rely on to say we're going to get this job done. So, I mean, when you talk about how tough it was in the early days, Nick, you probably understated. It was miserable in the early days.
Yep. Well, part of those early days, when I became chairman in September of 1998, I took a good long time in making that decision. It wasn't until May, actually. You guys over there, the Ambroses, might remember I came up to Montana in the end of May that year and had a really heart-to-heart talk with Steve, who always bolted, quickly in the spring to get up there, and weighing the pros and cons, but I was leaning toward doing it. At that moment, I get a letter from General Livingston that was addressed to Steve, and somehow it got to him. It was copied to me, and said, look, we've got to get Nick to make a decision here pretty quick, because we only have $100,000, and we're going to be out of that by August, and we have got to make a decision here going forward. And I said to Steve, I said, this doesn't look like the best of moment to step into this role. But in any event, as soon as I became chairman, I went to local architect, who was handling the renovations of the warehouse, the roof and the electrical and the AC and leveling out floors for the exhibits. And I said, at that time there was a freight loading dock. That was going to be our entrance pavilion. You come into the area where they brought the trucks, and we were going to put a Higgins boat in that area and a Jeep, and that was it. And there were no offices, and there was no store, there was no restaurant, just the third floor for the Normandy galleries. So I said, this is not going to work. I said, we got to get to the state, and that's what Boise meant. And I'm going to ask Jackie to talk about that, because I got the plans for this, and the architects hate me to use the word, but I said to P.O. Lyons, the architect, design a building that's as cheap as possible, that looks massive. I don't know what he said, it's a Butler building. He says it's the cheapest building you can build, and they go up fast. I said, that's what I need. And so he sketched something out. He said, you can do this for $3.5–4 million. And so we took that up. I called Jackie, who was on the legislature. I said, Jackie, can you get an appointment with the governor? She said, he owes me, and I'm going to tell her from there and get her started on that meeting. And I called Boise the morning she got it and said, Boise, can you come? And he said, of course. Go ahead, Jackie.
Well, good morning. And it was very exciting to be a part of that. First, let me tell you that the reason it was more exciting for me than most people, because I was alive in World War II. Yes, I'm that old. And everyone in my family was a part of the war. All of the men, my daddy, all my uncles served. Army, Navy, enlisted, and officer. And the women, my mother raised money for the USO. My aunts did Red Cross. And my sister and I knocked on doors and collected unwrapped things that could be sent to the USOs. And that's how the whole country was. Every family we knew, the whole family was in the war. That's why it was the war that changed the world. So it was very exciting to me to be a part of this, because I had lived it. And I even had an uncle, one of my uncles, my favorite uncle, who was a master sergeant, and then it was whatever the highest rank in the Army was. He was awarded the Croix de Guerre by Charles de Gaulle at Normandy for saving Patton's life. Just a nice old guy from Algiers, middle-class America. And that's the kind of war it was. That's the kind of people it was. And I had lived it. So to be a part of this with the Three Musketeers, as I called them, Dr. Ambrose, who told the story, Nick, who created the museum, and Boise, who found the money, was an absolute privilege and joy. And I did whatever they asked me or told me to do, and I don't usually take orders.
But you did get the appointment with the governor, so why don't you talk about
But
that
anyway,
meeting?
yes, but I wanted to preface that, please. And so I also got calls, before Nick called me, I got calls from Congressman Livingston and General Livingston. I knew both of them personally. Congressman Livingston was married to my cousin. General Livingston was commanding officer of the Marine Reserve Forces in Algiers, and as a councilwoman, I had worked with him. So they both had my cells, and I got calls, and they said, get to the governor now and tell him we need a commitment, a state commitment. We need first state money if we're going to have this museum. So I didn't call the governor. I ran to his office, and I was on my way to the podium to present our breast cancer bill that Diana Bajwa and I were doing together. We did everything together. And I presented that in a hurry and ran to the governor's office and talked to him from a phone from his front office. And I said, the 3 genius musketeers are coming and you must see them. And I was very good friends with Governor Foster. He laughed. And I said, you know, because Dr. Ambrose was supposed to be coming, but he went in the hospital. And I said, you know, he told the story, the Eisenhower biography, and Nick Mueller, who created the museum, and Boise Bollinger. Boise did something very phenomenal with the money. He didn't just raise money. He matched money. And if you want to get government money, federal or state, you tell them you're going to match it dollar for dollar with private money. It's a done deal. And that was brilliant, Boise. Thank you. And so I told the governor, I said, I have to have an immediate appointment for them, and we have to have a state commitment in order to get the museum. And Governor Foster, who also was alive in World War II, who also served in the Army, said, let's do it. And he did. God bless him.
Well, Boise, you want to describe the meeting? I came up there with the drawings, and the morning, I didn't know Boise too well, except just board meetings up until that point. But I said, Boise, Jackie just got us an appointment. We're going up. Is there any way you can come? And he said, of course, I'll be there. And he and the Governor Foster were pals, and they had fishing buddies, hunting buddies, and I said, I know Boise's going to help us push us over the line here. So walked in, there was Boise sitting in the back of the room as we walked in. Tell the rest of it, Boise.
Well, as you say, we had a great relationship, and he had founded an insurance company here in Louisiana called Louisiana Workers' Comp, and he was very proud of that. And he was in the Senate with Diane, and he was on the board. And when he got elected governor, he asked me to take his place on the board. Mark Drennan, who was the Commissioner of Administration, had been at the Public Affairs Research Council, where I was on the board, and had hired him as the CEO of the PAR. And they were always critical of state government and critical of the way Louisiana was running its business. And so Foster said, I'm just going to hire my biggest critic as my commissioner. So I had a great relationship with both of them. And Mike Foster didn't quite understand where the museum was, and he was questioning Mark. He says, now where is this? It's kind of a bad area, huh? And Mark said, well, no, Governor. He says, there's a Confederate museum there. There's a Contemporary Arts Center museum. There's the Ogden Museum of Southern Art. It's really becoming a museum district. And Foster said, well, that makes sense. Mm-hmm. And amazing to us, he said, okay. You know, most governors, you walk out and you wait 6 months to see if you're going to get any money out of him. And he said, okay, we'll do it. And then he said, well, now we got to match the money. We got to find some more money. But the reality is that's what let us build the Louisiana Memorial Pavilion and obviously have the success and redesign the warehouse that we were doing with a new entrance and put the boats and the planes in the museum. And but we were all kind of shocked when we walked out. In fact, he told me to stay behind. He said, how did I do? I said, you did pretty damn good. We didn't expect to come out with an answer. Thanks very much.
Can I
Jackie?
say one more thing? Mm-hmm. The governor, when we walked into the meeting, when Nick and Boise, I started to leave, and the governor said to me, stay. And he asked me all the questions. Well, fortunately, Nick had me prepared. And I said, as we're leaving, I said, and he kept saying, why can't it be in Baton Rouge? It's our capital. Why can't it be in Shreveport, the largest city? They have the Barksdale base there. Why can't it? Why can't? I said, the Higgins boats. The Higgins boats were built in New Orleans. Dr. Ambrose told the story in New Orleans. It can only be New Orleans. And so as we were leaving, I said, Governor, you had the two authorities in the room, and you asked me the questions, why? He said, you have to walk it through appropriations. And I said, oh, that's no problem. Everybody's going to want this museum here. He said, yes, in their city. Your job will be to keep it in New Orleans. And Diana Bashwaw's job will be to keep it in the right priorities. And so we had to work as a team. So thank you.
I'm going to turn this over to Diana here in just a second because that's a perfect lead-in. But one thing Jackie left out is Jackie and I walked into the room in the governor's office, and he's sitting on the right, and Boise's at the other end. And over on the left, right in front of the governor's office, is sitting Mark Drennan, who he mentioned. Now, Mark Drennan had a reputation for being the hatchet man. Everybody would go to the governor, and the governor had a way of delegating everything to Mark. And he would just cut everything. 90% of requests that came in, like ours, got whacked. And so Jackie said, oh, I didn't know Mark was going to be here. And so sometimes, and a lot of times in this whole process, you have to be lucky. And I was lucky.
Well, my brother-in-law was chief of staff, too. So
Yes,
that was another connection.
that was lucky, too. And lucky that Boise was free that day and could come. And then there came that moment after we'd made our pitch, rolled out the plans for this Butler building, said, we think we can build this for this amount of money and we can get it done in time for the grand opening. We cannot bring the world to the grand opening and walk them through a loading dock that was designed for trucks, and it's half the size. Anyway, it was a pregnant moment, and when, after all of that, the governor turned to Mark and said, well, Mark, what do you think? And Boise said what he said, and he said, I think it's a good project. And then we found out afterwards, I went to see him the next week, I said, we're really going to be able to get this done fast? And he said, I walked in there and he had about 8 of Steve Ambrose's books on his desk, and lucky again, he was a big fan of Steve Ambrose. But we had to do the work in the legislature, and Diana Bashwa came down to meet with me and Steve Ambrose to get to understand the project. Why don't you talk about the time you came down to the Eisenhower Center, and we chatted for a couple of hours.
Yeah. First of all, let me just say thank you very much for having me here. I always tell them I won't be long. I'm like Liz Taylor told her last husband. I won't be brief, but I'm gonna get right to. I'll get right to the point. No, but it was amazing to meet with Stephen Ambrose. You know, he was mesmerizing. I had never met him, and we sat in the Eisenhower Center, and he explained everything he was doing. I tell you, I felt like I was hypnotized. He was a great historian. And Bollinger, let me just tell you, boys, he probably was a very great teacher. And unlike you, I was in history and political science. I would have enjoyed him, and I did enjoy him listening to him tell the story about World War II and about all the in the benefit that was brought as a result of the Higgins boats. So I really, just sitting there, we must have been there for a couple of hours with him talking to me, but which was great. He convinced me on the need for the museum, but he still had a fight though. If you know anything about the Senate and the legislature, we get the last say so, and all those things that had been done in the House was irrelevant to us in the Senate. So, and we definitely relied on a senator for that district at that time, which was me, and I had a lot of other priorities and a lot of other needs, and I wasn't too familiar with this new need all of a sudden. What was the need for building a museum? So I needed to be convinced. And let me just be honest with you. After meeting with Stephen, he got me halfway home, but we still needed to see how it was going to take priority over some other issues in the district. We had lots of other needs in the district, and little did we know at that time how beneficial this museum would be to the city, to the state, and to the nation. And it was during that time that many of us had a chance to take, and I listened to Jackie. She said she lived through World War II, but I was born after the war. My daddy fought in the war. And I kind of remembered that after that came to me. We didn't talk about that, just like most of the people who was in that war. But I do remember him going to Veteran Affairs. And it's a little girl, I do remember that, and it kind of put me an interest as to what did he do. So I eventually asked him, and he told me what he did in the war, that he guarded prisoners in Guam, and which was a good thing. But however, but I knew maybe this was something, but I think what really got me was the Higgins boats. And when he said how the Higgins boats helped win the war, that was Eisenhower words, from my understanding, and how they had so many, it was such a diverse group that worked at the Higgins, and how he paid everybody the same. And that was important to me. As an African American, a black, that he had blacks and women working in there along with men side by side, but how all of them were paid the same thing. And so that was one of the benefits of people who weren't necessarily going to war, but who benefited those who were going. So that was one of the things that helped convince me. But however, when we got ready to do, and like Jack was saying, we needed to make sure that when the Capstone outlay, and I was listening to Nick, because there wasn't a whole lot of operating money. The most y'all was going to get at that time was money to build the museum. Because for some reason, legislators felt like that was money that was delayed. They didn't have to worry about taking that out of the operating budget. And so it wasn't easy, but it was much more palatable to take and do money for the Capstone outlay. So we were able to get money for the Capstone outlay to build the Louisiana Pavilion, which made a big difference in getting more people involved. We start getting more interest in it. And let me just tell you, I found myself going around telling people, once we finished it, you need to go see that museum, and that this is important. And I think that's what we wanted to come out of that. But we all felt like this was an important part of our history. And so then, of course, they had the issue, and I know Nick could probably bring that up, but then you had the resistance where a lot of African Americans felt like they were left out. But and it was explained to them that we were not in D-Day, but we were in the war. And so we made a concerted effort to make sure we brought those issues to the forefront and had special exhibits so people would know. And that way we could all show the important part we played in this war. And so I just want to say, that was one of the things that I was able to contribute as the senator for that area. And I'd be remiss if I didn't mention him. John Hankel was the president of the Senate at that time. And he and I worked side by side with this. He and I became very good friends. He was one of the most conservative members of the legislature. And I guess I was at the opposite end. But we worked very good and collective on this is one of the issues. And I think as a result of that, it helped us to work on other issues together. And so, not only did this this bill and this institution or the building of this museum brought us together, but it helped us to do other things in the future and to build upon that relationship. And so I just wanted to make sure I mentioned that because he's going on, but he was a very, very important part of this whole process.
Diana's understating her importance to what continued. That first appropriation, Jackie got us the meeting. She supported it. The governor had us committed. But every appropriation afterwards, even after we opened and we were a great success, Diana was at the table in conference committee making sure that any money we got from the House or the Senate stuck. And that, I can't tell you how important that is in the legislative process. She was the real champion that kept the money coming from the state whenever we had an appropriation. She was always vocal, saying this is a critically important institution that we have built in New Orleans and we need to continue to support. And be honest with you, without you, Diana, I think a lot of those appropriations, we would have fallen out of it. We wouldn't have got the money. So I got to brag on you some more.
I'm going to ask Gunter to say a few words here in just a second. I just do want to say after we met with the governor and he gave us the commitment, Mark Drennan was on board, Diana helped pull together a team of people, both in the House. Hunt Downer, Speaker of the House. Randy Ewing, I think, was the president of the Senate at the time. And and Felix Barham, and there were people you all don't know, but these were key players in the Senate. There's about 15 of them, and we came up a few weeks later with Steve Ambrose, and I said, what do I have to do? Because usually, once you get the approval, you got to fight for it all the way up until June to be sure you get the money. They said, Nick, stay away, we got this. Don't even come, don't bring it up. Diana and Jackie, and they all kind of moved it on through. And but Steve Ambrose did come up, and we had some meetings that was more social meetings and just them telling us it's all going to happen. So that was the lucky part. Gunter was working as the associate director of the Eisenhower Center at the time, and you might speak a little bit about what you were doing with Steve with regard to conferences and other programs in those years before the grand opening.
Okay, good morning. Thank you all for being here. Particularly good to see the Ambrose girls here, Grace and Stephanie. Welcome, and thank you, Nick, for having me. I think I remember the story a little bit differently from how Nick told it this morning. In the sense that I think the memory of D-Day played a very important role in Ambrose's life too. He recognized in 1984 how big the D-Day commemoration was. And wasn't the Eisenhower Center formed after that, Nick?
No, it was
before that?
83, but 84 was when he decided to write the book.
But 84, he realized that 94 would be even bigger. So if you speak of memory, and if Nick spoke of memory, Ambrose sort of recognized this even before it became a big theme in the historical studies community. So the Eisenhower Center worked very studiously towards the 94 commemoration of D-Day, and Steve would have his book ready by then, which was important. So I think it was both the memory of D-Day and the Eisenhower Center work that inspired Stephen Ambrose to move towards the museum. Now, what was it at the Eisenhower Center that happened that would make him think that a museum was needed? Well, Nick already mentioned it. It was very important. He collected the D-Day oral histories. And the way he did that was, if you think back, in a funny manner in a way, he would put together a one-page questionnaire for veterans. And he would say in that questionnaire, sit down with a glass of whiskey, turn on your tape recorder, and begin telling me your D-Day stories. That's how the initial collection of D-Day oral histories were collected. They would send in the tape, and there was a bunch of people at the Eisenhower Center. I joined in 1989 that would do the transcriptions. And they had a hell of a hard time to remember many of the French names. How do you spare Saint-Mère-Église and things like that? But what was important is some of the veterans sent in material history, meaning things. And that made Steve think we need a museum. I need to put all this stuff somewhere. And in 1991, I think in the fall, we taught for the first time a World War II course together. I went off to Munich that fall to teach there for 2 years, and we taught this course together. And we asked the students to bring what they had in their attics from their grandfathers. And lo and behold, they came with all kinds of weaponry and Japanese samurai swords and German Mauser pistols, things that you couldn't bring to a college campus anymore today, for obvious reasons. But we had an entire table full of stuff, and so Stephen Ambrose realized how much stuff that there is out there in the community, in the attics, that everybody had. And you mentioned families were involved in the war, and everybody brought back souvenirs. And they were being forgotten in the attics. And I think that's what the museum largely profited for when it was started too, that many people gave their attic stuff to the museum. And that's how you see so much valuable material history, not only diaries, but all kinds of other things in the museum exhibits, next to the oral histories. The oral histories would play a big role too in the initial D-Day museum, and also later on. I mean, if you see the new Liberation Pavilion, they play a big role there too, but it's become much more professional the way the museum does those oral histories.
Well, let's see if people want to say a few words about the grand opening on June 6th, 2000. Anybody have any special memories about that? I've mentioned it already.
May I?
I got to tell one story on Steve. That was that morning. He and I were walking in the Louisiana Memorial Pavilion, and as he always did, he bumped into people and wanted to know where they were from, and there was a young man looking up at a plane, Spitfire, and he says, where are you from? And the guy in a very British accent said, London. He said, well, where were you on D-Day? He said, I was flying in that airplane. Now, a little backstory to that. We had discovered, Pat Taylor had found out about this plane that had been crashed in a river and dug up from the mud, and he called me and he says, we got to buy this plane. He said, I'll restore it. It was $50,000. I said, Pat, we don't have $50,000. We got to buy this plane. I'm getting on the plane to London right now. I'm going to buy the plane. You got to buy it, and I'm going to restore it. So anyway, couldn't argue with Pat Taylor. We did it. But that moment when that guy looked up and pointed to that airplane, he said, I was in that airplane. I read about it, that y'all were having this museum opening, and my airplane was going to be displayed. And my tears just started falling. I said, this is what this museum's about.
Yeah. Jackie?
I didn't have a seat at the opening where they were cutting the ribbon on that side of the street. My seat was on the opposite side of the street, which was great because it meant I could include my husband, who'd grown up in the military and served in the military, and my uncle, the one that was awarded the Croix de Guerre, and his wife, my Aunt Patsy. I could sit with the four of us could sit there together. My uncle was dressed in his suit and tie, of course, and his little pin that had all of his medal, all his meritorious things on it. Every truck that passed in that fabulous parade done by General Mize, every truck that passed spotted that man and that little pin on his thing, and the entire trucks would come to a salute. It was so heartwarming. I still cry when I talk about it. Thank you.
Any other memories of the grand opening that you all want to share, Diana or Gunter?
Well, I was out in the streets and cheering people on. So like you said, 200,000 people.
Yep.
So I was in the middle of that. Yeah.
And as you saw in that picture of the ribbon cutting, I mean, the cast of characters on that front line was phenomenal.
Oh, yeah, and that's always been one of the ways this museum, through Boise's reputation, Steve Ambrose's, one way or another, we managed to get the Secretary of Defense Cohen there, the Hanks and Spielberg, Secretary of Transportation, Dave Mize as a general was there and running the whole parade. We had to put on a really big show because we knew that once that museum opened, we had to live off of the revenues that were coming from visitors and store sales. We didn't have as many sources of revenue in those days as we did. We didn't have tours overseas. And so it was critical. We didn't have money to market the museum either. So we had to make a big splash. We were on the front page of New York Times. We were on C-SPAN for 2 or 3 days in a row, all day long, and they kept rerunning it. So it was something. Diana, did you?
Well, I just wanted to, say it definitely didn't hurt us to have those movie stars there.
It didn't hurt.
So, I mean, actually, Tom Hanks was my favorite, but you also had Brocard and other ones, and I think that engaged other people who traditionally would not have been engaged in that to watch it and also to learn from it. So that's always important, to go across the spectrum when you pick up other individuals from other walks of life.
Are there questions from the audience? We have a few more here if you don't, but yes, in the back. I'll repeat the question.
Winston, I've
Jeremy's got a...
Thank you, Jeremy.
Thank you. Hello. Yes, since we've been talking about fundraisers, I'm wondering, can you talk a little bit about Sheriff Harry Lee's contribution during the early fundraising effort? I've heard something along the lines that he was selling posters.
He had golf tournaments to raise money, and he came up. He was on the. We had him on the board of trustees, and he came up to me one day, and he said, "So what do you need?" I said, "Well, you know, what can you do? And he says, how about 50,000? And I said, that'd be great. He said, I want to name your conference room. We called it the Purple Heart Society Conference Room because he says my uncles, Asian Americans, had Purple Hearts, and I want to honor them. And I got around to just before, about 6 months before opening, I only had $13,000 in my budget for office, for a conference table, and I went out to one of the office furnitures out there in Elmwood, and it was I mean, not much better than these tables that you're looking at here. And I said, we can't put that in Harry Lee's conference room, the Purple Heart. So I went back to Harry and I said, Harry, here are all the pictures of these things out there in Elmwood. And I said, but I had somebody else design out of fiddle mahogany a beautiful conference table with leather chairs all around it. And I said, do you want to do that or this? Because I only got, I can buy those things out of Walmart or wherever it was for 13. He says, I'll have another golf tournament. You go build that building. That's the sort of the way things happen. It was personal relationships, board members stepping out to do what they said. We had a big design competition, Boise, for the architecture and exhibit design. Do you remember some of that, or any of you do?
Oh, God, I remember it well. I mean, of course, we had Arthur Davis on our board as a former chairman, and he was an architect, renowned architect. And he says, you can't just ask people to spend the money. We're going to pay them to submit conceptual designs. I had never heard of that before. But he says you really get people's attention when you fund their effort for proposal. And Nick said it earlier today. The leaning thought was, we're building a museum, we're going to put it in a building, and when we open it, it'll be ready. And Bart Vorsinger came up with the concept of multiple buildings that we could open one at a time as we finished them. And when you're on the fundraising side, both government and private, and realize how slow you raise money in many cases, that concept was one that really was appealing, that we could get a building open, get it stabilized, have a grand opening, and then start raising money for the next building and the next building. So Bart's team one came up with this master plan, which Nick had a picture of earlier today, and what, to my amazement last night, we built 20 years later with almost no changes, So that competition was an eye-opener. I was chairman of the board, and it was a very eye-opener for me because I was leaning toward the one building concept, but didn't know how we were going to ever get it filled and built. And Bart and his team came up with this building concept, and it was the right decision. I mean, our campus is gorgeous.
Jackie, you wanted to say something?
Well, I was going to ask Boise, you remember when we used to talk about this, people thought we were crazy. I mean, they thought we were out of our minds dreaming of all of this. And we were so convinced that we could do this.
Well, Steve would always talk about endurance for this museum, that this is going to be here for a long, long time. And I remember we went to Baltimore for a meeting with the architects up there and the planners, and it was a time that we were saying, we got to cut the cost down. And they were saying, okay, let's take away some glass, or let's do away with an escalator, or in the designs we had then. And I was very emphatic, and I said, no, Steve's got the right message here. We got to build it right, because it's going to be here. It might take us longer, but it's going to be here for a long, long time, and we don't need to be cutting corners to try to get it built quicker. And the board agreed with that. I mean, I remember the biggest effort I had in a board meeting, I was no longer chairman, was about the canopy. And it wasn't about building the canopy. Canopy was always a controversial discussion, only because it was not part of the message. And we had so many things we had to get done before we worried about the canopy, which is a nice idea. And we were getting ready to build the Campaigns of Courage building, and I said, we got to put the foundations in first for the canopy, even though we don't build it. And it was for the foundations, which are substantial, it was $750,000. And the board was really hesitant. I said, I don't know if this canopy will be built. I think it will be. But if we don't put this foundation in now, we will never finish this campus as it's designed. And the board approved it, and we put that foundation in, unknowing if we were ever going to use it. And thank God we did.
There are two things I just want to comment on about that reflect something about the tremendous energy and intellectual commitment and passion that with the board. First of all, Boise said, as chairman, he came up to Baltimore and Washington, and Patrick Gallagher will remember that, and I don't know where you are now, back over there. And Boise sat through 2 days of meetings as Patrick and all of us looked at the first exhibits, and the price kept going up as we were getting to this final master plan. But your chairman was there, I was there, and that doesn't usually happen at that level of engagement. So that was the first thing. Then the other thing was the canopy. And Bob Hayes from San Antonio was the one who said, I think we shouldn't build this canopy. We can't afford it. We need to build the campaigns of courage. And let's forget about the canopy. It's nice, but it's just up there in the air, and it's not going to add to our content. Well, Boise kind of downplayed that. That was a shouting match in the board meeting that everybody who was there remembers. But it's one of the things that says this board is engaged, and they're debating the big things. And Boise was taking that long-term view. And Bob Hayes tells me afterwards, said, well, I understood after a little bit that it was a local thing. I was from Texas, and they wanted that canopy, so I backed off.
No, what I told him, I said, Bob, you're absolutely right. We will not build that canopy until somebody's willing to pay for it.
Yeah. But
I didn't think it was going to be me.
Any other questions?
Nick, we have a question to your right here.
Bart Forzanger over there.
Nick, I got you to your right, sir.
Oh, excuse me. Oh, okay. Bart, you have to wait a sec.
There's one name that I haven't heard today. I'm not surprised because the city forgot his name for 40 or 50 years. And that's Andrew Jackson Higgins. What do you think Andrew Jackson Higgins would think about what we see here today?
Well, I could just say I mentioned Higgins in the beginning, but I didn't talk a lot about him, but I think Boise mentioned him too. Andrew Jackson Higgins would be wild with joy, I think, but he's a bold guy. He was a kind of a swashbuckling entrepreneur, and he would love the way this museum got built because it took a lot of chutzpah and guts to get this building built. So have his boat. He always thought his boat was he was going to get the contract, and his boats were going to win the war. So I think we tell that story here.
But I mentioned Higgins as well, because he had a big part of my decision, helping me to support it, because of the way he built his boats and how he utilized all the diverse people in the community.
That's right.
And I think he made a big, and he paid them all the same thing. That was the other benefit. So, he should be somebody that we ought to look at for all of those reasons. So I just want you to know he is a very important part of this museum. He was very important to my decision as well.
And he lifted a lot of the African-American community up into the middle class through the war with a good and fair payment. And I think it changed the politics and the tone of the politics here because of this. Jeremy?
Nick, you've caused us to reflect back on some of these great memories, but particularly reflecting back on the opening day parade. Those of you who were there may have forgotten, but the weather was terrible that day in the morning. And I had about 4 radio operators with me. And as part of the parade, we had 43 planes from B-52s to modern planes, World War II planes. They're all stacked up out in holding patterns that were periodically coming through. We also had a big group of, I think, 40-some-odd Medal of Honor winners from World War II that were going to be out on the street in the weather. And so we were getting the latest weather forecast to see if we needed to do a shortened parade because it was the cloud cover was terrible. There was predictions for rain. So Stephen Ambrose and I were walking throughout the new pavilion, me talking on the radio back and forth, and Stephen told me, wow, this is kind of like what Eisenhower's going through to decide to whether to initiate the invasion or not. So he was really caught up on this, and fortunately we got a hole in the weather, and we were just breaking out our rain capes for those the VIPs and the Medal of Honor winners are going to be outside and whatnot. So we decided to go for it, and fortunately the weather cleared up, and we had a great parade. And nobody remembers about that now, but we were on the verge of having a very truncated parade because of the weather, with no aircraft as opposed to those 43 that flew so low over the city along the parade route. The other thing, Nick, and you and I talked about this a time or two in the past, but around the reviewing stand there was a lot of people at Andrew Hagen's Drive right in front of the museum. There were confetti cannons, and it was pretty neat. But the whole parade route, was 4 or 5 miles. And a lot of advertising had been done about the parade, but you never know who's going to come to the parade. Nobody's throwing beads. It's not like any traditional New Orleans parade. Are we going to have anybody there? So Nick very anxiously came up to me and said, do we have anybody along the parade route? And of course, I had to control the parade. I had people and radios all the way along the parade route, so I knew what was going on throughout the whole route. And I said, Nick, they're about 10 deep all the way the parade route. And what's happening was the people had made signs just on their own. Said, we love you, greatest generation, our heroes, etc. So as the trucks, the 6-bys that had the World War II members in it came by, the crowd would surge up to the, show their signs and hit hands with the World War II veterans, which we weren't seeing, at the center place. And it was just an amazing outpouring of thanks and connection with the veterans. And as they got off the trucks, the veterans at the end of the parade, and we had our military people helping them off, and et cetera, so many of them were crying and said, this is the victory parade I never had. And that, I had the kind of traditional, well, everybody got really well supported when they came home from World War II, but it was the ones who came home initially, that first 10% that got the parades. The others came home later as the point system worked out. And when they came home, the other 90%, was all done. So they just got discharged, went to the train station, came back home, and did their lives. So for those there, it was such an amazing experience for them, because this was the parade, victory parade, and the appreciation that was shown to them was just incredible. And that got them to talking to their families about World War II, and I got so many feedback. My father's finally talking about it. We understand. It was so, on a whole lot of levels, the opening there was just a great thing all the way around.
It was spectacular. And what Dave didn't tell me beforehand, that Secretary of Defense Cohen made him promise to have 100,000 people on the streets, and we had done a lot to get all the office buildings to empty their offices and let their employees go, but we had no clue. And fortunately, David didn't tell me that we had to have 100,000 people out there until the parade was underway. And so it was just a curious question, and then found out that the police who estimate crowd sizes for Mardi Gras said it was 200,000. It was just a astonishing day. So, Bart, you had one question over here. Do we have time for one more?
Bart, you get first question next session, I promise you, Mr. Vorsanger. We're going to take a quick 13-minute break so we could stay on schedule. Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Nick Mueller, Boise Bollinger, Senator Diana Bajwa, Dr. Gunter Bischoff, and the Honorable Jackie Clarkson. Thank you very much.
Well, good morning. While everyone's finding their seats, we're going to continue mission. This next session is about expanding America's National World War II Museum and how the vision of expansion became a reality. And, Nick set out the vision. The key task for strategic leaders, get the big ideas right, communicate those effectively, oversee their implementation, and then learn and adapt along the way. And so our tour guide for this next roundtable is Colonel retired Pete Crane, our Vice President of Education and Access. He joined the museum here in 2017, and he oversees all content, including the Institute, curatorial exhibits, the Media Center, Education Department. And so really is the tour de force of the content that we're able to deliver, but part of that learn and adapt along the way. And so with that, I'm going to turn it over to Pete. We've got an amazing panel here. And then certainly some of you have now saved up your questions. We'll get your questions and the questions for this panel before we conclude. So Pete, over to you.
Thanks, Mike. Good morning, everybody. It's wonderful to have everybody here. Unlike the last panel, I'm going to exercise the chair's privilege of actually staying in the chair. So I'm going to sit down here, and because obviously I'm not as young and vibrant as Nick is. So,
That's good.
You start these out with giving the introductions, and this is pretty much an easy one to do. I don't think there's anybody in the room here who needs to be introduced to the person next to me. So we have Dr. Nick Mueller. But we also have some other key folks that are going to be familiar to almost everybody here. We've got Bob Farnsworth, who I love to call Bob the Builder, because he has built not only most of the things on this campus, but also many of the iconic buildings and projects around this city before he came here. Bob's the Senior Vice President of Capital Programs here at the museum, and came to the museum team in 2003. So when I say he oversaw the expansions of the museum, we're really talking about Solomon Victory Theater, Campaigns of Courage, Freedom Pavilion, Higgins Hotel, and now, of course, the Liberation Pavilion. So it's wonderful to have Bob with us up here today, too. Another face that, looking out at this crowd, we have, when Mike and I were talking about starting this, this symposium, we said, well, it's going to be a Saturday morning talking about building the museum. Are we going to get an audience? And I said, well, we're not worried about this audience because it's going to be a friendly audience. These are our folks. And I said, yeah, but the other fact of the matter is we've got folks out here like Bart Vorsanger, Rob Malushin, Dave Mize, Gunter Bischoff, everybody that can shoot holes in anything I say up here because they were actually there. One of the guys who has always been there is right up here on sitting with us, Don Miller. Don has been a longtime friend of the museum and has been a serving presidential counselor since the very beginning in 2006. And he's been on the International Conference Planning Committees, and anyone who's sat in those meetings, Don definitely holds his own and brings a lot of great ideas to it. He's also been a featured historian on many of the museum's educational travel tours. He's been a teacher here, our Gilder Lehrman program Don's taught. And among the books that he's written is, of course, Masters of the Air, that is getting ready to come on out. I know everybody out there is as excited to see that coming out here in 2024 as I am. Don has been in the heart of all of this as well. And then we also have another key presidential counselor who's been there since the very beginning, I believe, with Mark Pachter. When we're going to talk a little bit about the role of the counselors here in a little bit, but in addition to his role as one of the originals and guiding presidential counselors, Mark has served on the Memory Wars Planning Conference and brings really a great unique perspective to the museum from his experience at the National Portrait Gallery and the National Museum of American History, one of my absolute favorite places. And of course, continues to offer his advice today. So we're thrilled to have Mark Pachter with us. And then the other guy that I think doesn't really need any introduction because you've seen him on stage about 15 times this week, Stephen Watson. Obviously, he's the president and CEO of the museum, but he hasn't always been the president and CEO. And he's been here for 20 years and has been, started out in fundraising actually came up with the idea of our direct mail campaign. So all of you who have gotten about 75,000 mailings,
Sorry.
that's the guy right there.
Sorry.
But he's also overseen the construction of various building projects here, Hall of Democracy, Higgins Hotel, Liberation Pavilion, and really carried the completion of our $400 million Road to Victory campaign through to completion. So, great wide variety on there. So, if you would, join me in welcoming all of our panel participants. So, in the last session, we talked about the idea and what was this campus going to look like? Was it going to be a single building? Was it going to be a road where you build as you can, which obviously was what came about. And if you're thinking in military terms or even in sporting terms, there is an intangible of momentum. You get momentum and it keeps the ball rolling to victory. And so it took a long time to get it going, and in 2000 got the museum open. The night before it got open, it got redirected to you can't stop now. But they kept it going and they had momentum. And then we get 2004, the national designation, and then Katrina hits. Momentum stops. So I'd like to pick up where, just after where we left off in the last panel, and talk about what Katrina meant. What did it do? And we already talked about momentum. So this is going to be a open discussion. Hopefully this just turns into everyone can kind of jump in, but I'll point this one at Nick first, and Nick and Stephen first. But then obviously, hopefully everyone else can jump on in. But Nick, what did it mean? What did Katrina do to your plans?
Well, of course, everybody knows it devastated the entire city, and everybody had to leave the city. The entire population of a major American city had to be evacuated. So it was traumatic. And as you said, just the year before, we had been in Washington, D.C. with the big announcement of our federal designation, thanking the 13 members of Congress who had helped secure that for us, who were World War II veterans. And Tom Hanks again came up for that. It was just a big, huge celebration up there, equivalent to what we have here. And I think our original price tag, Boise, was $182 million. And went up there to Washington to say thank you, and with hopes of more money. And then just a few months later, Katrina. And I think I lived in 8 or 9 different places before I landed in Baton Rouge. In about 8 days, 9 days, almost every other day I was somewhere else. Out of the city, you couldn't go back. The city was filling up. Finally, Stephen got a hold of me, I think in Orlando, Florida, and then Pete Wilson got my number. I don't know how, because Pete called him and said, "My God, Nick, what's happening?" He said, "I tried to call to find out," and he said, I was told that the whole 504 area code was gone. All the cell towers, must have been 50 cell towers, came down, and Pete said, "My God, what's going on there?" And I said, "This city is done." And so we got back, and it was a shock. I mean, we couldn't even get into the city easily because of the security concerns. They were getting everybody out of the city. You had to have a medical permit or some kind of hospital emergency care. Fortunately, one of our IT workers had a hospital. He was doing IT for a hospital as well on a consulting basis. He snuck me in along the sliver on the river, as they say, that was on high ground. Brokaw came down. He says, "Nick, I'm coming. NBC's flying me down. Can I see you at the museum?" I said, "I just got in once myself." I said, I could be there. I'll get there. And the 82nd Airborne was in town. And he said did the evening news from there off of a boat that had toured the city, and they showed the devastation of the city. And he said, and he did some film footage from the museum, and said that, interesting, the 82nd Airborne that liberated Normandy is down here trying to save the museum named in their honor. And it was pretty nice that we had them last night again at the Medal of Honor event. But it was tough, and Governor Wilson and Boise and all of us. And David Velker was the chairman. He was living not too far from me in Baton Rouge in an apartment. I got bounced around there 2 or 3 times before getting back to New Orleans. But they said, let's give us 5 scenarios. First, I had to lay off about 55% of our small staff. We only had 26 members on the staff after the cuts, and it took about 6 weeks to figure those out. We went from 65 to 26, and everybody was just kind of cleaning toilets and doing whatever we could do to keep the place clean, no security, no maintenance. And we had a fly-in meeting in Dallas, and I'll just make it short, that David Velker said, come up with 4 or 5 scenarios from going back to the D-Day Museum and scrapping the whole idea of a World War II museum. That's got to be one option the board looks at, because they were already talking about that. Let's forget the capital expansion. The other one at the other end would be keep it just as the way it was and just take longer to do it. And then 2 or 3 in between. And I built the budget on one of the ones in between, sort of a go-forward budget. And a funny line there, and I have half a chapter on this in my book coming out in 25. So we're sitting having this big meeting, and we had fortunately put together what we call a rainy day fund. There was about $750,000 in it the first 5 years. So I balanced the budget with that money, about half of that money. And Pete Wilson will remember, somebody at that board meeting said, well, what if we use that rainy day fund? What are we going to do if there's another emergency? Everybody kind of laughed. Said, if this doesn't qualify for using the rainy day fund, what would? And everybody, so then they agreed to balance the budget. We had a budget of just about $750,000 or $800,000 for the whole year, and we actually didn't have to use the few $100,000 from that budget at the end of the day. I'll tell you what is, and let Stephen talk about, because he was part of the rescue plan, because we had no revenues coming in from anywhere with the city closed down, no visitors. We didn't know how long. It could be a year or 2. Everybody was evacuated. There were only 20,000 left in the city when the storm hit, because it was a mandatory evacuation. But it's that direct mail program, folks. So you're going to keep getting those letters, but I'll let Stephen maybe talk about that.
Stephen,
Well,
if you want to jump in?
A couple things come to mind. First of all, I was glad to be one of the 26 that still had a job. So thank you, Nick. But you know, we all know, many of us were here. Those were tough times. Tough times, not just for our museum, but tough times for our city. And I think we realized that, actually, that we had to survive, and we knew that there were difficult decisions and things that needed to be done to put people's lives back together and put our city back together. But you know, this has been a tremendous week, and I knew this was the last thing that we had, so I didn't prepare much for it, so I'm just going to be honest. So I'm going to give you some memories of that time that are right off the top of my head. And Nick, I don't know if you remember this, but I think the first time I saw you after the storm, we were in Baton Rouge, and I believe it was Teddy Solomon's house, or
That's
one of the
right.
Solomon family's house.
That's where I stayed.
And I'm going to embarrass Nick a little bit here, but believe it or not, as savvy a guy as he is now, Nick did not use email
That's right.
until Katrina. And we sat in Teddy Solomon's office that day, and I created an email address for Nick Mueller in Baton Rouge. And I said,
welcome to the digital age for Nick Mueller.
So it's your fault.
I said, welcome to the digital, yeah, it's my fault. I said, welcome to the digital age. I said, Nick, we can't print out sheets of paper and put them on your desk every day now. You're going to have to figure this email thing out. So That is certainly one of my memories. But a few other things, come to mind. And absolutely, the direct mail program, we launched that actually right at the time that Dr. Ambrose died. I got to the museum in September of 2002, and 6 weeks later, Dr. Ambrose died, and we were putting this whole plan together. And 3 years later, after Katrina, I think at that time we had maybe 75,000 members, and the vast majority of them were not in this region. And it was $3.5–4 million, but those charter members sustained us during a difficult year, and I think there's a theme to that over the last 20 years, in the good times and the bad. Same thing happened 3 years ago, and this lady right here, Becky Odom, is one of the geniuses behind that program. And in our tough times, when we've needed to depend on the country and those that are passionate about our mission, they've been there for us, and they certainly were there, and they gave us a basis to sustain a core group of staff to get through that tough first year. I also want to mention someone's name that I will always think of when I think of Katrina, and that's Jake Staples. A few folks in this room will remember Jake Staples. He was member of our staff on our facilities team, and he stayed in the museum during Katrina. And there was a payphone in the museum during those days. And we were actually able to stay in touch with Jake. He would call us once a day, check in. And Nick mentioned the 82nd Airborne came. They actually found Jake sitting behind that map wall, Boise, that we were talking about the other day in the Pacific galleries. That's where Jake hid in the days after Katrina, and he was found by the 82nd Airborne. But he was a great man, a great part of this museum for many years. But one last thing I'd mention is, once the dust settled, once we kind of, had the plan to go forward, I also remember this great day we had on Veterans Day that year, where the Campaigns Pavilion is now. That used to be a parking lot, and we weren't open at that point. But we did a Veterans Day ceremony, and many of our volunteers came, our staff came, our supporters came. It was like a religious service. It was the first time that we had seen each other in months, and we knew at that point we were going to open in December. But that, to me, was the turning point. That was the moment when our healing, I think, began. We got to see our old friends. We were working towards an opening a month later. And then I think in the months that followed, under David Velker and Governor Wilson's leadership, and Nick's leadership, of course, we said, okay, we got to survive. We know that many people won't be coming to New Orleans, but how do we stay relevant? How do we serve our mission and stay relevant when we know we've got a journey here to get our city rebuilt and to get people coming back to visit the museum? And that was the birth of distance education almost 20 years ago. And I think one of the things we're most proud of here at the museum is we were one of the first museums in the country to bring World War II to the public in classrooms. And I think that will always be linked with the devastation that was Katrina. And you fast forward, almost 20 years, you heard Dr. Bell say the millions of people that are reading our articles, the daily programs that go into schools. When COVID hit 3 years ago, we were ready. We were ready because it wasn't new to us. It was something that we had been doing for a long time. So those are just a few of the memories that I have, and maybe later, to bookend that, I'll talk about another moment in time that I think is linked with Katrina.
Steve, for me, looking at it kind of from the outside, 2007 was the big turning point. With the decision you guys made, it was a really gutsy decision in the midst of you're still in depression, as it were, psychologically, financially, and you decide to go ahead with the Solomon Theater and the film Beyond All Boundaries, which had a gigantic effect on attendance, by the tens and tens of thousands. And that was a precarious moment. I mean, you guys were risking an awful lot. And I think Nick made a really gutsy decision there. You supported him. And I think the spirit of Steve Ambrose was always floating in the air during those years. What would Steve do here? Would he quit? Would he push ahead? Well, everybody knew what he would do. And I heard constant talk about that. But when we were putting together that film, a little but important anecdote here, story that involves Bob centrally, the builder of the theater. We're going to do this film, Beyond All Boundaries, and we work like hell on it. Nick, myself, you, Ambrose, especially. And we presented our script ideas to Hedema, and they put together a template. And they said it was ready. Well, it wasn't ready. Then it wasn't ready. Then it wasn't ready, months. Finally, we went out. Was it Pasadena, Nick?
Pasadena, yep.
We went out to Pasadena, Hugh and Bob and myself, and we looked at the film, and it just wasn't right. And you could see the deflation in the room. Nobody said anything.
It was a disaster.
Yeah.
It wasn't right.
And Tom Hanks was coming the next morning.
Yeah,
who are you going to talk to?
Tom Hanks is coming the next morning. So we said, we got to rally. Do we even want to show this to Tom? So we retired to a local bar, and we were there for quite a long time. And it was a very tense debate because it was kind of came down to a 2-2 vote about whether to just leave, maybe that night or early the next morning, and call Hanks. We were going to call Hanks before 12 o'clock and tell him not to come to Hedema Studios, that the film wasn't ready, and maybe we're not going to have a film. Somehow, I don't know, the spirit of the Holy Ghost was in the room, and we made the decision to go ahead and call Tom, and it's all on. And we met at the studio the next day, and we thought, this isn't going to work. Tom watched it very carefully, closely, and as you can see from his speeches here today, he's a quick take. And he's got a mind that assembles things, with amazing electric, speed. And instead of critiquing the film, he offered observations about the film, where it could be slowed down, where it could be speeded up, what could be added here. Nothing massive. He said, you've got something strong here. It just needs to be revisited, and that's not going to take that long. And somebody said, but are you willing to help? He said, absolutely. And he did. We got the film done, and the theater was built, and that was tense.
That was we were all at the bar, as you imagine. We're pretty shaken by what we'd seen earlier, and we're having a few drinks, and we're debating: do we call it off? I mean, is he going to be? He's not going to want to be associated with something that is really this bad, and or do we ask him to come help us fix it? Well, Nick kind of developed the strategy. Look, let's have him come and tell him that it's just not good, and this is why we need you, Hank, and that's exactly what he did. And of course, the relationship with Tom Hanks, and he reacted just as you would imagine. He just rolled up his sleeves and went to work and said, sure, this is part of the process. But going back a little bit to what Nick was saying after Katrina hit, you will not be surprised to learn that soon after all of the senior staff was located, we began daily phone calls. So, we were immediately started, we were back to work. We were planning the different scenarios and to present to the board ultimately. There were 6 scenarios, not 5. And because I've got 6A, which is the one that we ultimately accepted, still on my computer that I refer to every now and then. And we basically accepted, when we presented these to the board, I think we probably slanted them a little bit toward the direction of the mostly completing the campus as opposed to circling the wagons, I think, as you called one of the first scenario. But we relocated some of the U.S. pavilion, and the campaign pavilion now sits where the U.S. pavilion originally was. We eliminated about 34,000 square feet, and the rest of the master plan was left intact. Now, since then, we've added back much more than 34,000 square feet. So that didn't last very long. And another aspect of Katrina was that construction prices in the city just went crazy. So we were faced with, probably a $25 million shortfall to build the first phase, which we thought was really essential. Timing was important. We made these promises, and how were we going to move forward? Well, Ernie Eustace, a local banker with Capital One, had approached me in the neighborhood one time and said, "Bob, we want to speak to Jim Green, your museum CFO, and we approached him about these new market tax credits." And he just kind of blew us off. This is something you really need to take a hard look at. So I went back, and I can't remember if Jim was still working with us, but I mentioned it to Nick, and it was just, I think it was too good to be true. It was the response that we got from Jim at the time. And, some time passed, and Ernie sees me in a coffee shop and says, "Listen, you really need to go back and take a look at this." So I went in, I talked to Nick, and at the time, Becky was now our CFO. And he said, "Yeah, go ahead and set something up." So we set up a meeting with Capital One. I remember in the Purple Heart boardroom with four of their bankers. They came in and made about a 2-hour presentation to us on new market tax credits, which is an incredibly complicated way of just giving money out. But and at the end of that meeting, we didn't understand new market tax credits. It's so complicated, but we knew that this was a really good thing and that we were going to end up with a lot of money. And in fact, we made the shortfall, $24 million shortfall, up entirely with new market tax credits. So that was, the hand of God, I think, on our shoulder at the right time. And it seems like it's been that way throughout the entire expansion.
I knew that film worked. When I first saw it, I thought, how's the audience going to react? And as I was walking out, I was behind a couple. I don't know who they were. But the wife said to the husband, "My God, we could have lost that war."
Mm-hmm.
And that was the whole idea we tried to build into that film. And I know Patrick tries to build into his exhibits the idea of contingency. And if you want a quick definition of contingency, Tom Hanks described it when he described that early day in November when nobody knew what was going to happen the next day in the war. I call it the fallacy of hindsight that historians have. But anyway, it worked. It worked.
A couple of comments, a little backstory about that meeting that Don was talking about. Well, first of all, I want to go back to what Stephen was talking about and I'll come back to the Hanks thing in a minute, but you mentioned that first opening, not opening, just getting open, November 11, 2005, Stephen, right? And
that was the little Veterans Day thing we did in the parking lot, yeah.
Right, and there were hardly anybody in the city, and there was the New Orleans Advocate was being printed in Baton Rouge, and so we got a little bit of publicity about this, and I think there were about 2,400 people that showed up. I mean, now, that was a good day of attendance in normal times or just before the hurricane. Just to put it in perspective, we only had 600 more people, mostly National Guard, from November 11 till the end of 2005. So everybody came to that event, and then we're back to an empty a museum every day. But the other thing about that Hanks meeting, we had met with him already 2 or 3 times, and getting him involved in this happened at the wake of when Steve Ambrose passed, and Spielberg and Hanks flew in for that wake over in Bay St. Louis, and you all remember. And I kind of Hank says, well, what you up to? And we were kind of conceptualizing, or at least I was, this idea for Beyond All Boundaries was sort of my shorthand way to talk about how the war took us all beyond our boundaries. So just as a flyer, I said, would you be willing to help from time to time? And he said, sure. I said, I'll make sure that we got to get some consultants and figure this out, but I'll make sure I'll never ask you unless we're ready for a next phase of the script or planning. Well, that meeting was in, I think, May of 2006, about a year after Katrina. Might have been 7, Don, I'll check it. But anyway,
It was 7.
this was a time when we thought that what Hedema was setting us, that this was really a time. And I said, Tom, this is one of those times we think we're going to be in good shape, and your editorial work will really be helpful. Well, that was the setup for that tense debate, because we got out there and we all discovered the night before we were no close to ready, and I'd broken a promise. It's not easy to get somebody like Tom Hanks to come spend time, just like he has here for a couple of days, and he's done a tremendous amount for us to give us credibility with that show, with his editorial comments all through it, and the time he gave us. But then, like Don says, we decided that the strategy, and Bob said too, was we said, okay, we're going to go with it, and I'm going to sit him down and say, Tom, we apologize. This thing is not ready for you. If you want to go home, we'll just go home. But he said, nope. He says, let's roll up our sleeves and get to work. And he stayed with us all the way up to the end and all the
He
recordings.
stayed till the end. I mean, during the narration, I had the script in front of me, and I'm an inveterate reviser, and Tom is too. He had the same script. So we were really getting on each other's nerves. This took 3.5 hours, and we hated each other at the end of it.
I wouldn't say that.
But anyway, it was exhausting. And then at the end of that, I walk away, and Hugh comes over to me and said, can you get him to stick around a while and do a promotion for the museum? And I said, oh my God, he's tired, he wants to get out of here, But I went over and asked him, and he said, no problem. And this is pretty amazing. He went back, he put on a sport coat and a turtleneck, and we'd been in T-shirts all day. And he came out and slaps things. They start shooting. Perfect. He says, no. He did 12 takes, back and forth, and critiquing himself internally until he got it absolutely right. And you see, the kind of guy he is as a director, as an advisor to our film and things like that. Absolutely, totally focused, committed, and self-critical. It was pretty amazing. We could have went easily with that first take.
So, I was going to say with a great sense of humor, but he used to show up in Pasadena. I mean, he drove his Prius there, and blue jeans, like a blue shirt, rolled up sleeves. And one time he brought his lunch, and his wife had apparently written Tom Hanks on the brown paper bag. And I remember Phil Hedema saying, Tom, we would have made lunch for you, provided lunch. He said, no. Yeah.
So, question number 2. Now, I'd like to actually go back a little bit to the idea that Stephen was talking about one of the silver linings of Katrina being that we started distance education and very early. And it kind of hit me that, here's a museum started by 2 historians, 2 professors, 2 educators, 2 guys who obviously know the content and know the story. So why did you think that you needed to develop a presidential counselors? Why did you guys had the bases covered, but did you? What was the thought process there?
Well, there were two things that happened. One, as Stephen mentioned, was distance learning. Now, look, you got to remember, I was vice chancellor for 20 years and dean, and my responsibility was distance learning at the University of New Orleans, along with our international programs and research park and so forth. And we had some notions of the distance learning idea in the Center for the Study of the American Spirit that we were going to build actually before even the master plan in that wrong location on the site. So there were some notions that this was important, but we didn't have that plugged into our budget except for the building. The technology wasn't there, and I knew that, but we were trying to keep costs down. And so Katrina, as Stephen remembers, it was just a wake-up call for me. I said, how could I have been so dumb, you know, to be 20 years working in that field and not have thought more about this? Because here we had a city, we didn't know if we have anybody coming to the city for years, and the only way we could execute our mission as a museum would be through some kind of distance education via the internet or television or however way we did it. So that was, began planning for that right there. The other thing we began thinking about was, or I did, was as we were moving into planning our exhibits, the master plan sketched out what was supposed to happen in every building, and the road to Berlin, the road to Tokyo, and those things, and the various exhibits within them. But it wasn't just exhibits, it was our educational futures that we needed to look at, whether they were done on site with regards to programs and conferences, which Steve Ambrose and Gunter had been running every year. In fact, we funded the Eisenhower Center completely for the first year with, in '83 with a conference. So conferences were in view, and I needed more historians and museum leaders to help us think through all of our big exhibits that were on the drawing boards, and went up to Easton, Pennsylvania to be with Don for a couple days to look at Lou Rita's film collection, and we met in his offices. But it was there that I said, Don, I said, we need to do two things. We need to get a conference going, a big international conference, and we need to get an organization of advisors, of presidential counselors that could maybe meet. At first, we were meeting twice a year, but later on, we just shifted to once a year. And Don said, that's a great idea. So we started calling people right then. Well, Don, you might comment on that.
Well, Nick says, how are we going to do a conference? I said, well, let me make some phone calls. So we lucked out. I called Ken Burns, and Ken said, yeah, I'll come down. I thought, oh, good. That's a flagship name there. Okay. How about Andy Rooney? He'd be fantastic, you know. The only reporter in Europe, you know, to get an infantry star and an air medal. Called Andy up. He answered the phone. He always answers his own phone. Has no secretary. Andy, I said, Andy, you want to do this thing? You know, blah, blah, blah. Yep. Yeah, I'll come down. I said, Nick, we got a conference. It was easy to build around that. And that was our first international conference. Almost nobody turned us down on the telephone calls. And we did it literally in a day. Now it takes us aeons to put a conference together. But with just the two of us, it was really easy. And there were a lot of people who were available and things like this. And I'll say another thing about the presidential counselors. You know, we were, let's not disguise this. We were fighting, we had an image problem. What was that image problem? That we were too much of a Steve Ambrose museum. And Ambrose was getting criticized for his books being too patriotic, too much rah-rah America, not enough about critiques of things that the Americans did wrong in the war, maybe the second bomb, Nagasaki, et cetera, And that, you know, and I talked a lot with Gunter about this, that was pervasive, right, Gunter? And it was pervasive in the academic community. And so getting these top-notch scholars, indisputably strong scholars, linked into the museum, gave it some intellectual and scholarly cachet, as did our conferences. And those two things elevated us intellectually to the next level.
Well, I would just say I was never worried about Steve Ambrose's reputation in that regard. That wasn't the reason I wanted the presidential counselors. I needed them for other reasons.
Well, I was thinking of it.
I know you were, and others were, but
Nick, I got to
jump in here.
Go ahead.
Everybody's wondering what is this other guy doing up there. Okay, so I wasn't a major figure in Katrina. I certainly was part of the discussions. Not a principal figure in the presidential counselors in terms of some of these issues. But what wasn't said about me was I was in the Board of Trustees before.
That's correct.
I was in the Presidential Council. And the question then is, why the hell was this guy there? And that's all about Nick Mueller, okay? So this is what I'm going to want to say today. And I'm kind of a specialist in Nick Mueller because once we got to know each other, that was maybe first at a conference, or maybe I'd come down from the
D-Days in the
Smithsonian,
Pacific.
yeah, to see the D-Day Museum and learn something from it. And the Smithsonian doesn't usually do things like that, but I had already heard what fantastic place it was. But I got to know Nick Mueller and eventually persuaded him to do a whole series of interviews on camera that I hope one day will actually turn into a film about the making of a museum, and particularly a history museum. And he brought me in there because I knew something about museums, and he put me on the Board of Trustees, okay? That's a Nick Mueller gesture. You put this guy who doesn't have any money. He's actually not a war historian. I was an American historian. But he knows museums. And let me tell you the one thing that must be said about Nick Mueller. He knows what he doesn't know, okay? A lot of people don't know things. But knowing what you don't know and then going after the information, and to show you how much he felt that is that he put me on the Board of Trustees. Initially, those are where the decisions are made. The counselors counsel, but the trustees actually decide. And it was in some of the glory days. Every Board of Trustees for this museum has been amazing. But, you know, the founding trustees were amazing beyond belief. And so I had the privilege of having conversations with them about what a museum was. Because they also knew what they didn't know, but Nick really prepared them for the tough task ahead. And the money task everybody knew, but the thinking task and the building, and then having a building in which something happens that people actually want to come to, that took some convincing. So over the years, pretty much I went on the presidential counselors because I didn't want to give up this museum, and there was a time when trustees had to go. So I got into that group, and then I found out what I didn't know, because they were mostly historians of the war, and I wasn't. I mean, it wasn't my era, and so forth. But these conversations that I was privileged to hear first on the Board of Trustees and then on the counselors made me a great believer in this museum from the first. And I went back, and let me tell you, this is a good place to confess that history museums are not innately popular. If you just go in the categories of museums, the art museums are pretty much number one in terms of attendance and attention. Then the science museums, which are interesting mostly because people have families and kids get science almost more than the rest of us. And so but history museums had the habit of being reverential. Now, they need to be. I mean, we need to look at history and learn something from it. I don't know that we do, but we need to do that. Okay, but mostly people thought history museums were boring. They would go out of obligation. That's the one thing you don't want, people coming in out of obligation. I mean, that's nice if you get them in there, but then what do you do with them if they just walk out and say, I now know everything? They don't. They don't. So here's another tribute to Nick that I saw, and that is that Nick understood. He knew history. That was not an issue. and what you needed to learn from history. That was not an issue. He maybe didn't know how to do it in a physical space with things, but he got to know that pretty well too. And then, of course, Stephen and the rest know it, I think, the best of any museum in the world right now. I think it is the greatest history museum in the world. But what I'm trying to say is what they understood was the physicality of museums, the materiality of museums, so that people were, this was the time, by the way, where I was sent out by the Smithsonian to argue that museums were not dead. Okay? That was one of my jobs at the Smithsonian, because the digital age, these characters were coming in, and they were going to make it unnecessary ever to go to a museum. You could get all that information visually outside. Well, I felt from the first that people need space, and they need to learn together while they're moving through space, and they need to talk to each other. And by the way, they need a few other things. You know, you were talking about Ambrose's occasionally weird reputation, because historians can be very stuffy. And actually,
it was jealousy.
It wasn't just jealousy. It was the notion, they had the same problem, that history was only serious when, they wouldn't say boring, but when it was serious. And what Nick understood, Ambrose always understood as a writer, and eventually everyone as museum people, was they understood that people want to be entertained in the process of learning. And that's not a bad thing. That's a good thing.
The storytelling component.
The storytelling component, and the individual human component.
When I went down to the Museum of American History, I did an article on it for American Heritage before you took over. You tried to clean it up. But you walk through it, and there's a lot in there, but it's Grandma's attic. And there's a category here on Clinton. There's a thing here on Western expansion. There's a women's movement. You have no idea what, you don't, but in our museum, you walk through the war. It's immersive. You're part of it. It's enveloping. And I think Patrick's designs really reflect his commitment to exactly that sort of thing.
Yes, he knows space. And he found an architect who actually knew museums in space, which is, I can tell you, almost unknown in the world.
Well, look at the ceilings and things that we have in there.
Right,
you know,
right.
An architectural idea.
Right.
That you don't really think
But
about.
again, I'm going to finish with saying Nick got that. Eventually, everybody in this process got that. And we have the result we see today.
I want to make one sort of follow-up comment to that I think really aligns with that point, Mark, because it's an excellent one. And Patrick will remember this, you know, in those sort of years when, after Katrina, one of the good things that came out of it was we had some more time to think about all of this and work on it. And really,
that's a good point.
That's really kind of, I think, one of the benefits was we didn't have to rush. We didn't have the money, but the intellectual group had been brought together, and we had some time. And one of the really interesting discussions and I think decisions that we made at the time that really went against the grain of what was happening was all of these new museums were going in the direction of, when you went into the galleries, you had to go in with an iPod. And there was these banks of iPods that you checked out when you bought your ticket, and you were going to walk through these spaces because iPhones were new, and everyone thought that's what we had to do. And we talked to Patrick and his team about it, the counselors, and we said, no, we're going to do something completely different. We want to immerse you in the space. We actually want you to put your phone down and not be distracted by a mobile device. We want these galleries, these artifacts, these environments, this history to really take you to a place that's not your everyday. Now, you can take a photo, you can share it on Facebook or whatever you want to do, but there was a real push at the time that we had to integrate mobile devices into this museum experience. And I think 15 years later, I think we made the right choice. And that was really... And I know we're about to get shut down. I just want one more moment of privilege here. I want to come back and finish this Beyond All Boundaries thing. So absolutely right, Don. 2007 was a turning point. But the second part of that was when the show opened. And, you know, Nick, you've often said, and I think Bob said it, others have said it, luck is underappreciated. And 2009, when Beyond All Boundaries opened, we were lucky. We were lucky because it was also, I believe, the year when our city finally was on its feet and was recovered from Katrina. We also had the Saints going to the Super Bowl. Now, you all are going to think I'm crazy, but it changed the narrative on New Orleans nationally. That was no longer, Katrina was no longer the national narrative for our city. We had Drew Brees, who's both of his grandfathers served during the war, on our board. And Beyond All Boundaries opens, the Solomon Victory Theater, the Canteen, our visitation doubles. I also think it was the moment when it wasn't really a case of if we were going to get this done, it was when we were going to get it done and how it was going to finish. And we got serious in a lot of different ways. Our staff was rebuilt. Clem Goldberger, who's here, we established our marketing function for the first time. To me, it was really an important moment in our history where we had great momentum, and it all happened at the right time for New Orleans when the national narrative on New Orleans was changing. So I think that was a key moment for us.
I also think it was a key moment to decide to build Beyond All Boundaries and that type of experience initially when we were really leaning toward, building more galleries. And Nick, why don't you talk about, the decision between a 4D presentation or an IMAX? There's a lot of discussion about that.
Well, yeah, I began discussions with that with Tom Hanks at the wake for Stephen Ambrose, and I was struggling with we knew the master plan was telling us in 2002 that we needed a big wow experience, some kind of cinematic experience, and I said I didn't know what that would be, and when Tom was there while we were in the process of looking at options, I said, is it going to be an IMAX? I said, this is an epic movie or show that we wanted to, or that I had thought of, and the Beyond All Boundaries was a thematic part of it, but I didn't know if it was IMAX or the largest screen ever seen, where you could do it, because everybody'd seen most of World War II footage in black and white newsreels or black and white movies, and so I didn't know, and I just knew they were all going to be expensive, and I didn't know anything about how to do something like that. And here's Tom Hanks, who was not only a brilliant actor, but director and executive producer of IMAX shows and animation, so he knew all of this. So that was what he helped us to finally decide. When Phil Hedema proposed what he did, there was somebody that could tell me that, yes, this is a good idea, this can work, and it's not going to be Disney World, and it can be made to be entertaining, even though Disney used those technologies. So I think that was a kind of a threshold decision to go with that, and Patrick Gallagher brought Phil Hedema to us and said, this is the guy you need. And Patrick was our master planner for the whole thing, and he could find the right people. If his firm wasn't the one for us after he heard us talking about it, he would point us in the right direction and point me. And then he came in, and Phil made his presentation and got it. Let me just say one last thing about the presidential counselors, because I want to be sure. What Don said is okay, and that's maybe from the historians who we recruited, that was part of offsetting Steve's controversial thing as being too popular a historian and too much around the good war. But really what this museum needed, what I needed, our staff needed, our board needed, was an advisory group of historians, because Steve Ambrose was no longer there, regardless of whether his reputation was good or bad at that point. We needed historians, we needed museum professionals, technology professionals, to advise us to keep this museum, whether it was in exhibits or whatever, authentic. The integrity of this museum and its historical representation of World War II had to be the best in the world. Our exhibits, our programs, our conferences, publications, overseas tours were already underway in 2004, so and we needed advice, and we needed those people to participate in the conferences and lead the tours. And they have been a godsend to this museum. I know Governor Wilson, was he chairman? He even came to one. I've got pictures of him at the
First one.
presidential counselors meeting. What museum does that where an advisory group or the historians in Boise and others would come to listen to the presidential counselors sit there and debate each other each day? So it's been a godsend, and Don was there with me. We started at the same time we were calling people for the conference. We were calling people to join the counselors, and Elliot's one that came on in recent years too. So, and Gunter was there from the beginning.
And Patrick would bring in his team, you know, with their drawings, the architect would come in, and we were part of that whole thing.
Yeah, and we'd chew it all up, and he'd have to go back. So it was a hard process for a design firm to have that kind of a group around a criticism, but it made us all better. It made Patrick's team better, made us better. The interactive dynamics between the professionals who were consultants to design the exhibits and get the counselors saw the first run and first concepts before the board did, unless it was somebody like Pete who came to the meetings just to hear what was going on in the skunk works. It was like the Manhattan Project.
So we've only got a couple minutes left, but so I'm going to jump ahead to something because I really want to talk about where taking us into the future. And so hopefully we can have time later on for a question, because I really wanted to hit Bob up on a story about hanging aircraft in the Freedom Pavilion and going out to dinner. But I really want to jump to, I think, something that is kind of a transformative moment in our education plans and how we approach it and where we're going to be going in the future. And that is the idea of the museum beyond four walls and the creation of the Jenny Craig Institute for the Study of War and Democracy and the Media Center. Because in my mind, that really takes us to another area that you don't find in other museums. And I'd like to put Stephen and Nick on the spot for that. What was the genesis of that, and what was, were you laying the groundwork for where we are going to be going in the future with that idea?
I could talk about the start of it, and Steve can talk about the future, because he's in charge of the future right now. The Center for the Study of the American Spirit, which we had designed and had a press conference on, as Boise remembers, back in 2001 with Steve Ambrose, and designed that building. That was the introduction to the idea that we were going to have a research center in this museum that was world-class with top World War II historians. And we were going to have conference rooms, and we were going to have research and publications, because most of the great museums of the world have that kind of capacity. They have authorities there that are producing new knowledge and new research, which is what got Steve Ambrose into history in the first place. And that building got washed away with Katrina. Okay, so what were we going to do? And Steve and I talked together about that, and instead of the Center for the Study of the American Spirit, was now the Jenny Craig Institute for the Study of War and Democracy. It was a little bit easier to communicate people what this is all about. There's a whole long discussion. We could say, why the study of war and democracy? And you don't have time for me to explain that. But Stephen and I, when we were designing in 14, 15, 16 in there, we're talking about the Hall of Democracy, and we had several things. We added an extra floor for historians. So the presidential advisors are still advisors, but we needed 7 or 8 top historians to help this museum become the trusted source of knowledge of World War II. And let me just pitch it over to you. That's the idea, and there was a library that got bigger. And some other things moved out of that space, and Steve can talk about the future there.
Well, just a little anecdote to that, and then I'll get into a broader answer. Nick, I think you might remember we got summoned to a dinner before a presidential counselors meeting. I think it was Don, Rich Frank, and Rick Atkinson that said, you guys need to get some historians here. So they were really pushing us along in this direction as well. But I want to answer that question maybe a little more broadly, because I think it's more within the Institute. And you touched on this, Nick, in your presentation earlier this morning. And I think this is another example of your brilliance, because I think the Institute is just one manifestation of how you have understood that our responsibility and the opportunity that we have as the storytellers here needs to be more than just a traditional museum. It's why we're sitting in this beautiful hotel and conference center. It's why we take Americans, students, and adults back to these battlefields to see where Americans fought. It's why we have a media and education center. It's why we have the largest grassroots base of support of any museum in the country. I think the philosophy and the culture of this organization has always looked at our mission and our work in the broadest sense. And I think the Institute is a foundational and an important part of the intellectual core of this museum and how we make sure that we tell the story in an authentic way into the future. But to me, it's just one of the many things under your leadership that you saw as the responsibility that we have to think differently and I think redefine what it means to be a museum in the 21st century. And I think that that is the work in the future that we need to make sure that that spirit of entrepreneurism and that culture that we have created here in this last 23 years remains. Because I think we've had a tremendous week celebrating all that's been accomplished, but I firmly believe that we have so much more work to do and that we will be successful if we retain that spirit, we retain that culture, and we bring the best and the brightest minds to this mission. I think we're going to be sitting here 20 years from now looking at another set of remarkable things that we have done to make sure that this important time in our history remains relevant and isn't forgotten. So that's sort of an answer to your question.
You know what, Steve? It's the genius of what you and Nick did in the sense of the great Dante once said that hell is a place where nothing connects. Well, here everything connects. Every time we talk about a program, we talk about how it fits into the larger schema. The conferences, for example, they fit into the travel program.
That's right.
The travel people come from, 2 or 3 trips in Europe, perhaps, and they're regulars attending. How many museums hold exhibits like this? I don't know a single museum, you would know this, Mark, that involves its public in more manifold ways than this museum does.
No other one.
And just also this, Stephen mentioned this hotel conference center. The conference center part of it is the rooms you're in right now were originally designed to be in that center for the study of the American spirit. The library that was supposed to be in there is now in the Hall of Democracy. The Institute historians are in the Hall of Democracy. They were supposed to be in the Center for the Study. So they're the same mission. They're scattered around. And they're also collection people and others and educators in the museum elsewhere. But what Stephen contributed to that, too, was the idea, we moved the iconic war rooms over to the Louisiana Pavilion, and we increased the size of the media center, which has all the technology for the distance learning. So all the things that were anticipated 20 years ago came to life in those discussions in 2014 and 15. And and all of those things that Don says, it connects, everything connects is I think one of the things that is unique about this institution.
Gentlemen, I'm going to take the floor moderator's prerogative because I promised Bart Vorsanger an opportunity to ask a question, which may be more of a statement, but that's his prerogative. Bart, please.
Well, actually, I was going to talk about the competition because I don't think I'm going back now to the beginning. I don't think, the public really understands what architectural competitions, how they work. The museum hired a consulting firm out of Canada called Lord Associates to put together a museum program. Their program was 115 pages, something like that. It was extensive, every room, number of seats, all that kind of thing. Then they went out, I think a list of about 45 architects, cut. I didn't want to be involved in this at all because I knew we were a small firm and they would pick a big firm and we would be paid $50,000, but I knew that we would lose $300,000. And so Lord kept coming back saying, don't drop out, don't drop out. And so we stuck it out, and then we were shortlisted, which meant we had to design the entire project in 8 to 12 weeks, something like that. At that point, I was the only person who had been in the Army, and nobody in the firm had ever been in the military. And our consultants, none of them had ever been in the military. And I said, we've got to do something about this. I said, this is impossible. So they found a friend, contacted the Pentagon, and we got Lieutenant Commander Voggy to come to the office from Washington. He was part of the original D-Day invasion. Omaha Beach, day 2, I think, something like that. He was commanding a Higgins boat coming in, and out of 100 men accompany on the boat, 12 survived. And he told the story, 2.5 hours, 3 hours, we had him going through. And at the end, he burst into tears, because he remembered that on the beach, there was somebody he tried to save, and he never asked his name. And he said, I never forgot that. Well, it transformed the team, because this is an emotional project. And the key thing about something like approaching something like this is emotion. But then when we looked at the World War II Museum, my late wife was a curator at the Met. My present wife is a museum director. I've been brought up in a number of museums. And I said, they're academics. I don't know how they're going to run this project. So I went back and read Stephen Ambrose's account, and it's something about, took 10 years to raise $11 million. And I said to myself, this is crazy. Either New Orleans doesn't have any money, or they don't care about World War II. I said, something is completely wrong. And then we had a drawing in the competition brief, a 3-dimensional drawing, showing what the museum should look like. I don't know if you remember that drawing. Okay. And it started with the D-Day Museum at one end, the 500-car garage at the other end, and a double-loaded corridor called the museum in between. And I said, they're going to crash, because they need to train staff. Nobody wants to give money to a classroom in the middle of the 3rd level. And I said, you have to have individual pavilions so they can train their people, phase this out, develop their program, and then people want to name buildings. And this is how, and what I'm so conscious of in working in a museum called earned income, and maybe what they won't talk about, but has been brilliant on your part, is the evolution of earned income. In other words, stores, income, taking spaces, making them available to the public for use. Anyway, it is a staggering thing. But I have only one question for Bob Farnsworth now that we're going through this, because Bob is in charge of construction. And typically in a project like this, they would hire a consultant on the outside who would be a construction manager of some kind. They'd hire the architect. They'd go through a number of crises. A thing would get built. The architects would be fired. He would be replaced. And then you go on, and then there's a new architect who then wants to redesign the whole master plan and changes everything. Bob, why did you take this job?
John Kushner.
All right. Unfortunately, we're over time. There's a whole lot more we could have done.
Why'd you take the job, Bob? Or why didn't you quit the job, maybe? It's the better question.
No, I mean, what a tremendous opportunity to be part of something that's this important. I mean, it's important for the city, it's important for the state, and it's important for the country. I mean, to be, I mean, this museum is really special, and it did not take me long, meeting with Nick Mueller. I mean, John Kushner saw me at a Mexican restaurant and said, Bob, we're building this museum. There was an article in the paper that day. He said he had known me from when I was director of design and construction for the Harrah's Casino, and he said, you need to come over here and help us build this. And he said, it's a $150 million project. And I said, John, do y'all have $150 million? And he said, oh, yes, we do, which was a lie. And so, about literally days later, I meet with Nick, and I think we got along really, really well. And it was, just maybe another week later that, that we had connected, and that I was initially brought on through the end of 2004, as a consultant, and then I can't remember what the details were, but then came on as as a vice president, immediately. And but I could see that this was something that was going to be important. I could not possibly have envisioned what we have today, and what it really means. But just kind of playing off on what you said about how your team of designers got emotionally connected to this. I mean, even though we have to publicly bid our projects, one of the first things I do with the contractors is to meet with them and to make sure that they understand that this isn't just another brick and mortar job. I mean, this is something special. They're fortunate to be a part of, a partner in building this great museum. And it was the same thing when we would go up with Beyond All Boundaries and going to Pasadena. And I was going up more often than others because they were building the infrastructure there. So I was going up to inspect the work off-site in that area. But they would always make the Mousetrap team would make a presentation virtually every time about, showing me the progress, and go around and each one talking about their connection to World War II. And it was so emotional. And I think that's, it's just, I think that all comes out in what we have today, the connection. We're a museum of personal connections. It's how we tell the stories, and I think that's also, in a really important way, how we've built this museum.
Ladies and gentlemen, Pete Crane, Nick Mueller, Bob Farnsworth, Donald Miller, Mark Pachter, and Stephen Watson. Thank you, gentlemen.
As we dive into Liberation Pavilion, let me do a quick survey. Who here has not been in Liberation Pavilion yet? Okay. So a whole bunch of you, so we could dive in and we could start talking about it. We want to do just a quick drive-through so people that haven't seen it get a sense of what's ahead, and some of you that have will get some insights as we go. So, there it is, the big giant piece there. As you come in, those who served really lays out this personal dimension. 10,000 dog tags on the left to represent the 16.4 million Americans killed in the war. On the right are images of those Americans who did not return home. And it really personalized an incredible set of images. I think about 70% of which are from our collection. Does that sound right, Aaron? And, so it really sets the stage on the first floor, finding hope in a world destroyed, but it's a shattered world. And then as we come into the cost of victory, perhaps my favorite of the artifacts is there in the center. We'll talk about that, but we'll talk about the human cost. And we're not starting with the triumph of the war, but with the actual cost of the victory itself. And then we'll go back in time, set up the Nazi racial laws, the Nuremberg laws that set up the foundations for the Holocaust. And then we have a reconstruction of the hidden annex where the Frank family will hide out in Amsterdam. And then ultimately their betrayal. God bless you. We move into the Holocaust galleries. And then from the Holocaust galleries, we have a piece on the liberation of the camps. And then finally the Liberation Theater, the 30-minute segment, with these authentic voices we heard, in these oral histories. It's the day of liberation from the perspective of the liberators and those who are liberated. And so incredibly powerful opportunity to hear those authentic voices. From there, the visitors will go into Faith in Wartime. Incredible piece here. In the centerpiece is the story of the U.S. Army transport Dorchester, torpedoed in the Labrador Sea with 4 chaplains on board, 2 Protestant ministers, a Catholic priest, and a Jewish rabbi that will give up their coats, their life jackets, their gloves, help people into the boats, and go down with the ship praying together. So a memorial chapel. Some of us will need that reflection place you know, as you go through this content and really think about that, a place to leave a remembrance. Then as they, from there, people go into 3 galleries on the monuments, men and women, the grand plan for Nazi looted art, but what we did to preserve the fruits of cultural heritage and civilization, with another immersive gallery and incredible piece. As visitors go upstairs, it's the celebration and the initial returning home. There's some artifacts that, you know, most of us would collect from the battlefield and bring home with them. But then we get into the serious piece, the responsibilities in the fight for freedom at home and abroad that come with the post-war world. And we'll work on reestablishing justice, creating the United Nations, rebuilding former enemies, the Truman administration, then look at economic and social changes at home, technology from the war, and into the gallery on the fight for freedom at home and abroad, and the relevance of the 4 freedoms today. And then finally, we'll let the visitors and the veterans have the last word as they move in. And the 3rd floor experience is done by the team that produced Beyond All Boundaries, the Hedema Group, and what was Mousetrap has become Medici, produced the Freedom Theater, which is a pretty amazing opportunity as well. So with that, we've got a sense of who's been there. I think people will find the emotion and drama. If you haven't been in there yet, you'll see it in spades. With that, I'm going to join this panel, and we're going to continue mission. I'd like to start with is this kind of, you know, Patrick, you've been involved in the design here. And I'd be interested in your thoughts on the design for Liberation Pavilion, and you know, what are some of the tenets that you built into that, and in some ways, how does this pavilion similar but also different than the other ones you've worked on here so far?
Well, I think it was discussed earlier. I think the principles of the design for this museum had always been not only the foundation of using oral histories, because in our industry there's nothing more powerful than personal storytelling and the impact that it has on all visitors, not just young visitors. We've experienced it directly in Holocaust museums, working with Holocaust survivors, but then with all the veterans here, that emotional connection became so foundational to continue that into Liberation, but also the immersive character of the exhibit environments and the architectural environments. I don't think most people in the room would understand from the perspective of what we do and what Bart does. Story is everything for us. So you won't see a drawing come out of our office sometimes for months or years until we get the story correct. And throughout the discussions today, you've heard about the brilliance of bringing together specialized consultants. Oftentimes, museums spend a lot of time navel gazing and realizing that they think they're the best storytellers. This institution has always brought in the best and the brightest. And on Liberation, Elliot was one of those, that real hand-wringing of what's the core of the story. And we could have had 50,000 square feet and it wouldn't have been enough for Liberation. And going back and getting the story right and then start thinking about what do you add? How do you add collections? How do you add the immersive character of the environments to just enhance that level of engagement for someone? Because we know that in a museum today, you're at a much more heightened sense of appreciation and learning and grasping the content if you're in a space that feels like the story you're trying to tell. But if we didn't have the story right, we'd never get the design right. And Liberation was by far the most challenging pavilion on a lot of levels. Not just what would we leave out, but what would we keep in, and driving it toward the broader sense of understanding one of the most complex stories that we've ever dealt with, and that was the world after World War II, both
in good ways and in very challenging ways. And that's where folks like Elliot would come in and give us clarity. You're missing the perspective here. You need to get the perspective changed. And we designed many spaces there, probably 17, 20 different times, just till we knew we had it right.
So Elliot, how about if you give us, obviously, what is it that we had to get right? What are those themes, or the theme that was so powerful for you as you were, kind of helping us through this process and cajoling or mud wrestling or whatever we want to refer to this as?
So just quick word of thanks at the beginning to Nick and Steve for getting me engaged in this great institution. And to Pat and Aaron and their teams. As I'm a professor, and to see the range of people who have to be engaged, the curators, the archivists, the researchers, the designers, and they did a marvelous job, and I just really want to express my thanks. For me, there were three critical themes which I think are at the heart of this. First, that the four freedoms would be at the core of the theme, because we had to have some sort of message as what is this all about? And I think the four freedoms, freedom from fear, freedom of religion, freedom of speech, freedom from want, that captures it as well as anything else. And of course, President Roosevelt had that out there even before we're formally engaged in the war. Second theme really has to do with capturing how the war shaped the United States through the Cold War, to include, if you think about it, all of our presidents, from Truman all the way to George H.W. Bush, touched by, participated in the war. But for me, I would say the most important part after the four freedoms was that this conclude not simply with a celebration, although there obviously should be celebration of those who served, memorialization of those who sacrificed, recognition of the accomplishments, but that it end with a challenge. With that theme of the passing of the torch, which we'll all remember from the John F. Kennedy's inaugural, torch is passed to a new generation, his generation of veterans. And that, so much of the audience are teenagers. And they may not feel a direct personal connection to the war. What's important that they feel challenged. I'm just to make it very personal. This past year, I've been in Ukraine, where there is a European liberal democracy that is under attack by what is, in the technical sense, a fascist regime that is seeking to wipe it off the face of the map. I've been in Taiwan, which is another liberal democracy facing pressure from an Asian dictatorship. And very shortly, I'm going to be going to Israel, where you've had the largest massacre of Jews since the Holocaust. The World War II generation did an extraordinary thing for their time and the period immediately succeeding. But I think very, very important to give the message to succeeding generations that you too will face your challenges, and they may require you to step forward and serve in one way or another. And I think, to my mind at least, the Liberation Pavilion accomplished all those things.
So kind of related to that, Patrick, you said, you went through 17 to 23 million designs. Elliot, you had kept pushing here. I have to keep these themes. Nick, I know previously you described the Liberation Pavilion we have now has kind of shifted over time, that earlier it had more of an American perspective, but almost had to bring in much more similar of an international perspective that Elliot's describing, to bring in the international order, international norms, and America's responsibility and role in those things to a greater extent. And maybe you could comment on that if I got that right.
Yes, you did get it right. And Patrick Gallagher will remember that when we got to the end of our master planning process in 2003, after designing 7 pavilions of what was going to go into each of them, we had the Liberation Pavilion was at the end of that. We were pretty exhausted, but I felt like, well, it's the American experience, so we're going to talk about the legacies of the war in terms of technology and medicine and civil rights and women's rights and impact on our military and our defense, and it was all that made sense, and a little bit about mentioning the Marshall Plan and what we were doing abroad, but it was very American-centric, and I felt increasingly uncomfortable with that over the years. And after Katrina, actually, and we had time, as Stephen said, to think about some of the long-term things, and so I started thinking we came out of the world a changed nation. The war changed our whole society, changed our nation, and we were, instead of being 17th in the world, as Steve Ambrose always said, in terms of our military strength, we were now a superpower. We were the leader of the world, and certainly the leader of the free world. And the visions for helping to extend democracy and freedom and human rights flowed into the institutions, like you mentioned, the United Nations, and then the Marshall Plan and NATO, and all of these. We had broken out of isolation, and it seemed like, to me, we had broken out of it for good. And like it or not, historically, what happened too is as we reached out, we Americanized much of the world, as well as giving democracy. And Coca-Cola was everywhere, and American industries were everywhere, and that brought all of these different cultures and countries into us. We helped to end decolonize and turn many countries became independent. Many of them went behind the Iron Curtain. There was a Cold War. But in any event, it was that global perspective that began to think about, and spent time with our presidential counselors talking about that. Board members were a little uneasy shifting away from the American focus, and so it took 2 or 3 or 4 years. I mean, at one point, when Paul Hilliard, our trustee, received his Horatio Alger Award, some of us were up there. Phil Satry, who was the chairman, was up there, and I said, let's go talk to Sarah Bloomfield, who's the president of the Holocaust Museum, and see how they keep their story relevant beyond the war. And so we spent a couple hours with her that day, and with Sarah Ogilvie, who's on our presidential counselors. And they said, we've been most successful in extending the relevance and the legacies of the war if we connect to something in the war or in the experience that our core exhibits are about. And that led to Boise Bollinger heading a task force with John Georges. I mean, these are board members, and John Kerner, and then a special task force of the board. But Boise came down and said, finally, after 2 or 3 hours with Patrick was there, Phil Hedema was there, I said, the board has to come down has to give me the direction of a theme that we can build this around. And after 2 hours, Boise and John Georges said, it's freedom. Let's build it around freedom and the extension of freedom at home and abroad. And so that took about 10 years of rethinking, and a lot of hard work staff-wise. We talked about it with the presidential counselors, but I think that process was a very creative process for everybody involved. And I know Patrick Gallagher and we talked about freedom, liberation. We talked about what other museums were doing on those themes. And I looked at European museums, too, that look at the end of World War II very differently from the way we do. It didn't mean freedom for Poland in 1945. So in any event, it was a very difficult, challenging, and in other ways rewarding process.
So let's, based on that, I know everybody up here probably has a favorite artifact, personal story, gallery, something of that. And I think this would be helpful for our audience. Give us your sense of what your favorite is. I've got my, unfortunately, it's not a favorite. It's like 5 favorites, but that's okay. But maybe, Aaron, how about if we start with you? Is there something in particular that you find most memorable, most passionate, or really wanted to ensure that stayed and didn't make it on the cutting floor, but really persevered forward to this final incredible product?
Sure thing. So first of all, I want to say that asking a curator what her favorite artifact is like asking her who her favorite child is. It's very difficult. It's very difficult to pick just one. And like you, I have a list. I jotted down, I think, a dozen things. But But I will say that I think there are certain things in the Liberation Pavilion that we had known from the start were our must-haves. They're the things that absolutely had to be in those galleries. And you know, we selected, and I say we, I'm referring to our team, a wonderful team of curators, of collection managers, of oral historians, who talked about, you know, the content of these exhibits. But you know, we established some of the must-haves, and I think the artifact with the most gravity, both literally and figuratively in the space, is the coffin transport crate. It is in the Cost of Victory gallery. It is you know, impossible to miss, and it was, you know, the crate that was used to transport the body of a service member who was killed in action from the place where he was temporarily buried to his family. It has the aluminum plate that was looks like a dog tag, but affixed to the coffin crate, and you know, has his name you know, stenciled on it. So it's a very personal item. It's a very intimate thing. I think extremely memorable and a very intense thing. So that was one of the things that was always on the list. And there are many other things I could go on for a long time, but I'll let others.
No, I'll second it. If I had to pick one, you know, that private's transit case, you know, to bring him back to his family in Lorain, Ohio. And I think it speaks volumes about its individual, but also shows the extent to which, you know, we've gone to either bring people home or value their service. And then it also, you know, we still have 72,000 Americans missing in action from World War II. It also gives us a sense of those numbers as well. I mean, the gravity of this, just from that one piece there, I think is incredibly powerful. So I had to cut in. So let's skip Nick real quick. We're going to go to Patrick, because what is it in your design that you're most passionate about? You know, and you know, have tenaciously fought to preserve or keep, or you're most proud of.
Well, Aaron's right. The difficult challenge of creating any exhibition, we have tools that you use to engage, and artifacts are part of that, and making those hard decisions, which one comes in, which one comes out. I don't have a single favorite, though. I will say in this pavilion, the crate is not only jarring emotionally, but just incredibly powerful, and it draws you near it, and into a certain degree keeps you away from it. But I'm really drawn by the very small things, the diaries, the letters, the photographs that are worn to almost tissue, that you know that someone went to all the trouble to keep that and preserve it. It meant so much to them. And you see those in the cases, and you see someone's life right there. And it, without having to read a label, without having to understand the context, you know that that was so special to them that they protected it through the war and carried it with them, saved it in an attic somewhere, and could never give it up. And we now have the both important responsibility and honor to keep that passion and their story alive. So for me, it's those very, very, very small, what could be insignificant to most people.
No, absolutely. And Elliot, how about you? I know you were able to go through yesterday afternoon.
Yeah, I mean, that coffin transport crate, obviously, all the small artifacts, but I'll actually, the thing that in some ways moved me even more than that is the way in which, Pat, your team designed it so that there are a lot of individual faces that you see close up, of liberators, of victims, of average soldiers. I forget who it was who said one person's death is a tragedy, 1,000 is a statistic. Well, we're talking about 65 million. So how do you bring things home? And I think by seeing people's faces in a big screen, and it forces continual reflection all the way through.
Nick, what do you think?
Well, artifact or gallery favorite?
Gallery or
Well, for me, it's the Liberation Theater. I think you're probably not surprised by that. And that's the oldest and first idea I had when we were doing the master planning in 2001. Steve Ambrose was still alive and out at the Universal Studios for Spielberg, doing recordings of veterans in preparation for the HBO series on the Pacific. And I wandered off to the back of the Universal Studios because I heard the Shoah Foundation was there that had collected oral histories, 55,000 of them, and most of them were collected and organized, and they're all volunteers and a bunch of trailers in the back. And so while Steve was doing that, after I listened to a few, I went back there and I asked him, I said, do you all, because I'd seen the scrolling videos of very powerful ones in the Holocaust Museum up on the fourth floor, I guess it is. And it was just riveting to see people just watching the stories of the Holocaust. I mean, but we're not a Holocaust museum, but our connection to it was the liberation of the camps. And the moment the gates of those camps are open and what they felt about freedom. If freedom was going to, ultimately, that part was, even before we had a theme for the whole Liberation Pavilion, it was about liberation already because we had named it that. I said, do you have the names of survivors or the videos or anything? At that moment, I said, I don't have time to listen to an hour or 2 hours of an oral history here, but if you have it, oh, sure, we have it. Just at that moment, is that what you want? When the camp gates were open, I said, yeah. You want the liberators or the liberated? You got both? They said, yeah. And they sit down, and 15 minutes later, I was looking at a TV screen, and I saw 20, 30 stories, 2 or 3 minutes each. And it just knocked my socks off. And then they had some from the American GIs who were opening those gates and what their feelings were when they encountered the camps. And it's powerful. And I said, that's going to be in the Liberation Theater. And that theater has come to life. And Erin and her team and the Shoah Foundation continue to provide more that we've reviewed. I don't know how many times we've looked at those and edited to get them just perfect, as well as the liberators. And I just was in there the other day, and just people are just transfixed by it, and it's very, very powerful. And I think that's my favorite and the longest in gestation period, I should say, in terms of the creative process.
No, it's incredibly powerful. For those who haven't been in there, it's a 30-minute long, no narration. It's just the authentic voices of the liberators and the liberated. And I think we need a Kleenex station as you go out. You know, certainly the chapel will be a powerful place after that as well. So let's transition a little bit. You know, I'm going to ask you guys, you know, what does World War II mean to you today? And, you know, or reflections on either the legacies or the lessons from this. One thing that strikes me, you know, there's the old saying that the World War II veterans, you know, came home and didn't talk about their experience. And I think that's true. Occasionally it gets unlocked or did. But they also didn't talk about the cost of their achievement and what their achievement meant and what they built after the war. And I think this Liberation Pavilion gives voice to that in a way that I think our veterans would absolutely understand and appreciate. The creation or the elimination of tyranny, the freedom of the oppressed peoples, the rise of American superpower, economic, political, social, the changes, and then also the creation under American leadership of international institutions and norms valuing democracy, freedom, and human rights. And I think that, in my mind, is the legacy of what we've done, and the you know, captures what does World War II mean to me in a small sense. So I'd be interested in what you think. You know, how does this shape the discussion about what does World War II mean? You know, that's the third part of our mission. The part that, you know, I think was in many ways the most difficult, because it's always the conversation that keeps going. So Nick, how about if we start with you? We'll go down the line, and we await your wisdom.
Well, spoken a lot to that in the last 2 days, so I won't take too much of the airtime here. But so I think everybody has heard, my feelings about liberation and those themes that Boise picked out for us: the freedom and democracy and human rights is running through the themes, and going to veterans who, so many of them in our oral histories talk about that. They, during the war is why you fight. I've had a lot of veterans say, well, first we're just fighting Japanese or we're fighting Germans. But as they got closer to the end, they began to realize, and you hear that on their tapes, and there are many of them say, we're fighting for freedom, and this is the enemy. This is just horrible. These kinds of fascist tyrannies, and so they began to think about those things, and of course, in their later years, they reflect perhaps a little bit more and infuse different meanings into their intentions. I mean, they were. As one said, he went from being a citizen to a soldier, and then from a soldier to be a killer. So there's always that element of the military, and during combat, you're trying to survive. So there's pathos there, and there's the guilt they come home with, and we have to deal with that too, and POWs and others who had those kinds of experiences, but. As I've said, there's always been a moral tone to how America felt during the war, about why we were fighting. That was driven primarily by Roosevelt, but there was a war training office. There was what you might call propaganda, but the Why We Fight movies that were used to teach the troops, the movie tone news that you were seeing in the theaters. The Four Freedoms were in many houses, along with the Rockwell photos. This country was united in a very special way, and I never met a veteran that or homefront person who didn't remember the unity that this country felt during the war, and so we wanted to bring that out and. Ultimately, to leave people with the question as to what will you do with the freedom that has been earned for you by others, and through sacrifice for those who survived and came back with trauma, and for those that were left behind, the war orphans that Stephen has spent so much time bringing them into the fold of this museum, and to understand the hole in their lives. By having lost a family member, a father, and so there's a trauma, but there's a moral tone to the war that the values and the ideals that we fought for and that we tried to put in place, not perfectly for sure everywhere, but those values drove the post-war world, and for the last 80 years up till now, the future takes care of itself. People change, societies change, but for now, that's our story.
Thanks, Nick. Erin, legacies and lessons from your perspective?
Sure. I think there are so many ways you could answer this question, and I will choose to focus my response on something maybe different from the very lofty concepts of liberty and morality and our responsibilities as citizens and all of that, and maybe talk more specifically about the things that people take for granted, the subtle. It's so subtle and so ingrained in our way of life that we barely think about it. But one of the challenges to populating the Liberation Pavilion with artifacts was that it goes beyond the World War II era and into the modern day, the modern era. And we had to think about, what are the legacies of World War II in a very literal, physical way. So we have materials that represent, the later civil rights movement, the women's equality movement. We have materials that reflect innovations in technology. We have, things made of plastic. I think, if we think about those things we use every day, a plastic water bottle, right? A computer, a cell phone, what links those things have to the events of World War II. I think we'd have a much better appreciation of of World War II and our modern, ways of life. So for me, it's, a visitor going through and thinking about World War II, and it's the way that we can connect that history to their everyday lives in a very real way.
Well, absolutely. I think anybody that goes through this series of, oh, I didn't realize that's from World War II, or the immediate post-war. I mean, it just as you go through, and so no matter what perspective they bring, whether it is plastic or the United Nations, I mean, the challenges are tremendous there. Patrick, how about from your perspective?
Well, I would say a number of things, and I'll take a little walk around the block because of one of my first moments here with Nick, and we were standing in the D-Day Pavilion, and at that time, most of the visitors were older couples, a lot of veterans, and Nick looked at me and he said, "Your job is, in the future, to have this lobby full of 12-year-old kids, because that's our next audience. That's our next generation." And the struggles for really thinking about what an institution like this means into the future, how do you take the story of World War II and keep it relevant and timely and part of the national and international narrative, was part of what made developing Liberation so challenging. It would have been easy to say, let's stop at the end of the war, we're done, the boys are home, it's all over. This was such an important heavy lift because of the relevance of what's going on right now. And we deal with young people in museums all around the world, and one of the first questions you get when you're working in concepts related to the military and conflicts, young people who don't believe much of anything they see on the news, they always ask, why are we there first? Why are we sending all this money overseas? Why are we always in the conflict? And somehow in the historical narrative of the end of World War II and to where we are today, that message is lost for them. They don't understand it, and so the timeliness of this pavilion couldn't be more important, because the sense of what they're going to learn about what freedom means and how fragile it is, but also foundationally being able to use this Liberation Pavilion in the very important educational work that Stephen and Nick have made a commitment to do, for not only for what they do today, but what's going to happen in the future. That Liberation Pavilion will keep this message of World War II completely timeless. And you can't take a young person in there and not find an immediate relevance to what's going on their handheld, on their television, around the world, and get them to ask why. Why? What does it mean to me? And so the important task of getting us there, we may have made some mistakes along the way, we'll always admit to mistakes, but we've done something that will keep World War II in the dialogue of the future. And not just as a historical narrative, but for what we stand for as Americans and what we need to teach the next generations that come along. And I think that that's what makes this such an important pavilion and such an important museum.
Yeah, I think that notion of relevance is incredible. That World War II might be the largest war in world history, but a lot of young people don't see why that matters. And whether it's the impact on life today or what we take for granted, all the way up to the relevance and how to understand contemporary events. Elliot, what's your thoughts?
So this, I think it aligns with what Pat said, but it also goes back to something Don said in a previous panel about history being contingent. And the way I think about this is, well, suppose the Japanese had not been stupid enough to attack Pearl Harbor. Suppose Winston Churchill had had a heart attack or had been thrown out of office. All completely plausible. You know, and I think it's very important. Let's remember the America First movement, which wanted resolutely to keep us out of all that. Some of the best and brightest in the United States, including, of course, many who then subsequently served. And I think it bears reflection that, you know, it didn't have to happen this way. It could have happened very differently. And what would the world be like if we had not fought that war? Or if it had come to us later and in a very different way? What world would we live in? What United States would we live in? And I think, you know, that too is part of the mission of the museum, and make people realize this was not inevitable that it turned out the way it did, with all the flaws and, of course, all the sacrifices and suffering. It could have turned out differently and much, much worse.
No, I think, and as Don had mentioned earlier, you know, how do we overcome the hindsight and have people recognize that these are pretty dark days in 1942 and 43, and you know, even if we look at the degree of American mobilization, economic and personnel, I mean, I think it's staggering for most of our visitors. They can't comprehend that degree of mobilization today, or the degree of everything in there. Nick, I know you wanted to add a point, maybe, you know, a holdover from one of the questions on the last piece, and then we can go into some questions from the audience.
Yes, Mike Byland came up and at the end of the last session asked, why don't we talk about our operational excellence here and our entrepreneurial DNA? And Don Miller said it in a different way too, said everything here connects, and one reason they connect is on the operational and the execution side that is driven foundationally by the fact that we have to be a self-sufficient institution. We don't have government operating support, and then Mark Pachter was talking about some of my strengths of knowing what I didn't know and going out, whether it's historians or museum people or people in technology, to try to or buildings or whatever, and I guess that is true. Desperate in survival, you go for whoever is an expert at something you don't know anything about. But I would say that one of the things that I did bring to this museum that helped to change it from your normal museum that opens the doors and counts on visitors and government support to operate. Because for 20 years I had been my career in higher education after 10 years of teaching was to be a dean and vice chancellor and higher continuing education and extension. And I have one of my colleagues here, Dan Shannon and Deb, who was president before me of the National University Continuing Education Association, which is the most entrepreneurial aspect of higher education, and where everybody who's in leading positions of administration in universities, we're 400 universities, and it's a professional development organization that you learn from each other about how to generate revenues for your universities through conferences, international programs, lectures, programs and products even, and overseas educational programs. And so it kind of moved into my own consciousness, is that what this museum was going to have to do? And so building that, even the design of buildings, Patrick and Bart would know, said the Louisiana Pavilion has to be open enough to have programs and groups and conferences that we can generate revenues. Same thing with the Boeing Center. Everything in the Boeing Center has to be on rolling stock so we can move it out, and we can have, like the last few nights where we've had 500-700 people, and you can raise money through sponsorships and programs. You can attract troops, people, to groups and rentals. And you can do webinars. And our institute is doing this online degree, the master's degree with Arizona State University. And Stephen and Mike preside over that with the institute members, and the media center too, which helps to produce. So we now have one of the fastest growing master's degree programs offered by Arizona State University jointly with this museum. And that leads to so many connections but they also get down to the operational bottom line. We have to generate revenues beyond just visitation. And Stephen's direct marketing program, which generates a huge amount of our income to this institution. And I think, and the magic thing is not just about the money, it is about the money at the end of the day, but there's so many creative things and programs and ideas that come from the partners and sponsors and the visitors who come, and our conferences are sold out every year. What history conference do you know that people pay $1,000 to, general public, to hear great historians and museum people talk on provocative ideas? I mean, historians don't even pay that much to go to their own conferences. So, in any event, I think, and Stephen Watson, the reason he is, my successor at least, the board made the decision, but I said if there's a, you don't have, I had to find people who didn't know what I didn't know. I didn't know that business. He's a numbers guy, and he understood that direct marketing. And the energy that comes from, the excitement that comes from your own institution, and that the board understands too, is one of the things that helps to reinvent this museum in a way that it's made it the great institution that it is. It's a good old American way, you know. So it's a nonprofit institution that runs off of what we call earned income, which is profits. So
when I get asked around the world, show me the best example of a museum that's run like a business, and I always send them here. I'm sure Stephen gets tired of my sending every new museum down. I said, go learn, go pay attention to some place that did it right. This, in the museum world, this museum is the museum Swiss Army knife. And it is everything that it could possibly be. Nick was right. We'd be designing pavilions, and he'd say, okay, well, that's 8 to 5. Well, what about after 5? And what about on the other weekends? And what are we going to do there? So they are, by every stretch of the imagination, the top of the pyramid when it comes to what a museum model should really look like.
But it's a really, really big Swiss Army knife.
It's a big Swiss Army knife.
So let's see if we have a time for a question or two from the audience. I know it'd be chance. You know, I had a couple to close with, but I think we want to make sure we get the veterans and the visitors a voice in this.
We'll start to your right, panel.
Hi, I think this is a wonderful place. I'm from New York City, and last year the museum let us use some wonderful pictures in Times Square for Veterans Day. And I had 20 World War II vets in Times Square. And one of them, 101 years old, said to me, "This is the best day of my life." And the bubble over my head is, you're 100 years old, maybe the day that the war ended, when you came home, when you got married, had kids. But I didn't say that. And I said, well, can you tell me why? And he said, I thought everyone forgot about us. Okay? So let's always remember it's about them and the few that are still left. Let's remember to always honor them in the best way possible.
We'll stay to your right.
Thank you. I think one of the things you should be most proud of as you consider your accomplishments is there's something that happens every day of the week that we're open. Visitors walk into the Freedom Pavilion, they look up and they go, wow. And then they say, how did they get all that stuff in here? And I lie and I tell them it's like Disney, it's magic, and yeah, and we can't tell you, but you should be very, very proud of that. It's an amazing accomplishment.
We'll go to Governor Wilson.
Gentlemen and lady, I think that all of you can take just pride in what we have accomplished. But I do have a question. And the question is, it goes back to Nick's point that he wanted to see the audience and the people waiting to get in. to be a huge number of 12-year-olds. And right he is. However, the question is, in a number of states, there are very different educational systems. And the question that we have left unanswered is, so we won that war, and my God, it was wonderful. It was terrific. But as it points out, it was at great cost. The question that I have is, in those jurisdictions where there is no teaching of how you avoid it in the future, that question is not answered. We have left that one unanswered. And I think that for all of the extraordinary efforts that have been made, if someone is coming through, and there are not very many left, we've lost Woody Williams, and we've lost a whole lot more, and we're going to lose them all shortly. And the question is, how do we avoid this ever happening again? And it's not answered. And it isn't answered in this sense. Right now, at this point, not only is Taiwan threatened, not only is the Ukraine threatened, but clearly Israel is threatened. And in all three of those instances, well, not yet Taiwan, but there are people in the world who are not believers in freedom or democracy.
That's right.
And the Ukrainians have been devastated, and they're fighting back. And God love them for doing so against Putin. And in the case of Israel, my God, what is happening there? Where the announced dedication of those who are in the tunnels of Gaza, there is a stated determination to destroy Israel. And it hasn't yet happened on Taiwan, but they have announced very clearly in Beijing that it's going to happen. And we do not supply a preventive for any of those things occurring. And instead, we have, from time to time, really let things slip. We had a sequester. And the military people understand what the hell that meant. It was a tragic mistake, I think, because what we want is to prevent this ever happening again. And how do we do that? We, as a democracy, are we'll stay a democracy, but we may not keep the rest of the world away from it. And somehow we've got to make it clear to people who are 12 years old. Somebody is going to have to teach them. And I've got to tell you, California, which once had the best public school system in the nation, no longer does. It's a disaster. And that changes from state to state. But I think we need to answer that question.
Well, Governor, maybe I'll take a first crack at the answer, but I would say that I would beg to differ with you a little bit, because I do think there are 3 or 4 places in the museum where we address that from a historical point of view of how we got into the war and how we were totally unprepared for the war. The isolationists held sway in the late 30s, almost up to the beginning of the war. As Steve Ambrose, and we quote this several times, that we were ranked 17th in the world in our military preparedness before the war. If it had not been for Roosevelt a year before to institute the first draft, and the second time it passed only by 1 vote, there was a sentiment, as you well know, you're really a great historian in your own right, but there was a great sense of we don't want to be involved in those Asia-Pacific wars or the European wars. We wanted to be insular. We didn't want to fool with any of that. We thought our oceans would protect us. And we make that point in the Road to War very, very strongly. It's also in the pre-show of Beyond All Boundaries. And it's also in the head of my show a little bit on the third floor about what was happening in the 30s as the rise of authoritarians in Nazi Germany and Italy and what was going on in Japan, and that much of the world thought of democracy as passive and not a force for the future, and that communism and fascism, the authoritarian ideologies were strong. So we do address that. Admittedly, we don't have an entire floor to talk about the 30s. We have about 3,000 square feet in the Road to War, where that's, and we do have conferences too that where we delve into the origins of the war. But what we don't do, and perhaps we don't, in the Liberation Pavilion, perhaps what we should have done, if what you would probably say, is where we have slipped or where we have not done, and we have tracked maybe the weaknesses in our defense as the defense spending went down after the fall of the Berlin Wall, and we began to close bases and ratchet down defenses. But there's still strong isolationist movements in this country, as you know, right now, and don't want to fund the Ukraine, and so it's. We're not in a position of telling people what they should believe. We, as a history museum, we always feel like we should focus on what happened. And I think there's a strong consensus that we could have lost this whole war had we not started to mobilize in the end of 1940 and early 41 in Lend-Lease and so forth. So there's a story there, there's a history of how we could have lost this war because of our unpreparedness. And I think that gets answered 2 or 3 places, and it's certainly discussed quite a bit within our planning team. And Governor, you always remind us that we need to pay attention to it, and I know that Mike knows that, mentioned that several times with quotes from Reagan and others, and Eisenhower, and in the Liberation Pavilion. But there's always room to improve. So, Elliot might have some thoughts.
I'm going to just so we can kind of bring this out. Let me pull it together. Governor, I think the point you're making is there's unfinished work. There's plenty still to do, and some is. We have to engage our audience both in person but also online. It's not just 12-year-olds, it's 20-year-olds, 30-year-olds, 40-year-olds. It's the American public and others around the world. We have to continue to kind of quest this. Why is this relevant? Why does it matter? How do we give them a framework or a lens to judge current events, to understand their responsibility? Why the rest of the world does matter. This is kind of Roosevelt's view. If only America's there and you have no one to trade with and there's no democratic partners around the world, what will our democracy look like? So, is this infused into our articles, our international conferences? our teaching, our public programs, civic engagement, leadership, it has to be, because it has to keep relevant and also adapt as the world changes. There'll be, new challenges with that. So I think that's really the key, and it's not just the teenagers, it's the teenagers' teachers and the institutions, and so this is a tremendous piece. Nothing like having a mission as a reason to kind of continue to work for this. So I think what we have to turn this into is the next passion as to why we're serious about this. There's a lot to do. One of the last questions I was going to ask, this panel was, how did we do? And I'm just going to flip that to the audience. Go see Liberation, and you kind of can judge us. How did we do? And figure that out. And like anything that there's compromises and choices and making sausage. But I think in many ways, thanks to the team working this, I think you'll find there's an incredible experience, and it'll also force us to think. We'll ask questions similar to those Governor Wilson just asked. I want to thank everybody for coming today and being part of this experience. Not just today, but this entire weeks of experience. But this is the culmination of decades of incredibly hard work, but also very passionate work. A quick alert to some upcoming opportunities. If you think this is fun, tune in December 7th to 9th for our 2023 International Conference on World War II. Don mentioned that in the early stages and what that's done. You can still register and enjoy that online. It'll feature, some of the world's leading scholars, some of the best-known historians, for 3 days of kind of a deep dive into World War II history. On March 1st, we're hosting a free all-day symposium, which coincides with our special exhibition, Our War II, Women in the Service. And we got some flyers outside of the registration table, have some information on our website. That new exhibit will open just over a week, I guess just over a week from now. Be pretty incredible. I'm kind of a fan of women in service, having married a woman in the service and having a daughter in the service now. A little passionate about that piece too. So I think you're going to find it's an incredible piece. And last, come join our block party as it's continuing on. One of the final events today to celebrate, the Congressional Medal of Honor Society reunion and the campus completion, the Road to Victory celebration. And most of all, I just want to say thank you again for your support, for your encouragement, for the great ideas, and we're going to do our best to try to meet all those. So I hope everyone has a great day.
Mike, it's Patrick. Can I go rogue? Can I go rogue for about 30 seconds?
Go ahead.
I think what I would hope everyone can join me in is a little applause for my good friend Nick Mueller for a job well done.
How about more than a little?
I didn't do this alone there, so Steve shares a lot of that.